Good morning, ma'am.
I'll mail you the PPT in 10-15 minutes.
Okay, ma'am. Sure, ma'am.
Thanks.
Morning, Saikat.
Good morning, sir.
Thank you.
So we will begin as soon as our first resource person joins. Just waiting for 1 minute. Good morning, Arunadi. Ma'am, please unmute yourself. I guess you are muted.
Right. Yes. Am I audible now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So good to be here and to be part of this.
Okay, so we'll begin. So, good morning, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you to today's national webinar on Unearthing the Nuances of Feminist Thought in Contemporary Times, organized by the Department of English, Coach Bihar Panjaramarma University. First of all, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude and regards to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Nikhil Chandra Roy of Coach Bihar Panjaramarma University for allowing us to organize a webinar in virtual mode. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Sonab Samazdar, the head of the Department of English of Coach Bihar Panjaramarma University, to kindly deliver the inaugural speech. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Sarkar. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
So, in the Bildungs of mind or my selfhood or my sense of myself, this is the first time I am inaugurating something. And in absentia, like a Derridian trace, I am representing to the authorities of Kuch Bihar Panchanan Barma University, namely Honorable Vice Chancellor, Mr. Registrar Sir officiating, Mr. Dean of Arts. I first of all would like to congratulate a priori before the event happens, like a future which is not time out of joint, but here we have joined Dr. Soikat Sarkar for organizing such a seminar, and I declare as part of the official ritual this seminar now inaugurated, open, which means inviting many to participate, many to articulate, and many in plural to be active. I believe that that is the ultimate motto, in spite of its divisions and diversities of feminisms, which I take as a word in the plurality, instead of a monolithic singularity of a hypothetical woman for whom certain type of a singular theory or thought should exist. As far as I understand contemporary, or the term or signifier contemporary, the most ethical part of that signifier, if we could anchor the slippage or the radical indeterminacy of the signifier contemporary, would be co-temporary, where the subject exists respecting the difference of the object, where the self exists respecting the difference, the radical difference which is not cannibalized into any hierarchy, icon, or hierarchy of the other. The masculine, the male, the patriarchal, the androcratic, the phallogocentric, the phallocentric. These signifiers would recede, would be relegated into oblivion if difference is respected and difference is not territorialized, mapped into a hierarchy of high and low. If difference becomes horizontal instead of vertical in the ladder of power and in the ladder of poleros, the politics and the eros. I would like to say that the subject is never a complete subject. As far as I feel and believe, the subject is melancholic because it has lost something. It has the fear of losing something. It has the anxiety of losing something. And it has to recompensate for its incompletion by a fantasy of completion, by incorporating several cementing objects into the subject, thereby nullifying the existence and entity, the sovereignty, and the bare, let's say, being there of the objects, and cannibalizing, assimilating, annihilating at the same time the radical difference into some kind of reference. This is what patriarchy has done for ages. Because patriarchy was never contemporary, and feminisms are always contemporary, whether it be black feminism or LGBTQ feminism, because it has the ethics of contemporariness. For example, instead of William Shakespeare in sonnet number 18 saying, proclaiming, affirming that this gives life to thee, and this obviously is a phallic signifier here. Either the pen or the man, the homoerotic bonding, on a piece of paper impregnating the nullity, the vacuity, the emptiness, the non-entity, the secondariness of the paper, which didn't have inscriptions on it, impregnating with meaning. This model is radically rejected by the model of Ekriture feminine, where the self includes the other into itself. By cosmopolitanism, where Walt Whitman, for example, would say across race, across class, and most importantly, across gender, the stranger is mine in the sense that I belong to the stranger. The anatomical particularities into a stranger, that poem by Walt Whitman, that belongs to a particular sex, they cross the boundaries because the self opens the porous boundaries of itself in a negative capability in a true Keatsian sense to the other. And that is co-temporary. Keats says negative capability, where Keats doubts the completion and assurance of his subject and opens the porous boundaries of his ego, of his selfhood, of his imago, to the world. And the world in the form of nature would come into Keats's self-definition. Or for example, Kamla Das, in the poem Forest Fire, would say in an what is in figure of speech or in Bosan Starling language, epanaphora or anaphora, in me, in me, in me. So the me is no longer a Lacanian hubris or ubri. It is no longer a sovereignty of the selfhood. In me, what? In me, you. In me, he. In me, she. In me, it. In me, them. The epanaphora, the plurality, the technical repetition of the same beginning in lines after lines is what I would say femininity, femaleness, and feminisms in plural have been practicing in their own ways from the beginning of gender and from the beginning of creativity, if we could extend it, even before and after the division of labor. So the point simply is to be contemporary is to be co-temporary, and contemporary is not a chronological term in the sense of 21st century alone, but it is a chronotopic term, not a chronological term, and things come back. And I would urge the listeners to feel it in my inaugural speech. I give one small example because, see, I am the unmelancholic subject being the inaugurator, the ritual inaugurator, so I don't have the burden to answer the questions, the interrogation session, the interaction sessions. And being an old man, proud of that privilege, I use the signifier man in the sense of human. I would insist that all should feel what is contemporary is this chronotope. In our Indian ontology, অতিথি, যার আগমনের কোনো তিথি নাই, the one whose arrival has no fixed date on calendar, and who is an absolute stranger, whose strangeness I did not headhunt into the naming of my head, the one whom I could not interpolate, and the one who does not suffer the hegemony of the gate at which he, she, or it arrives. The Otithi, the absolute stranger, whose difference I feel and respect, whose difference I neither want to suppress nor want to cannibalize into my nutrient. The self being respectful to the difference with others in plural with O small. The point here is that was what was the traditional Indian epistemology. Mehman, to whom I cannot be Gaddar. The one who is absolute stranger and it is in my fold of hospitality. If that is not contemporary, if that is not cosmopolitanism, then what is? The point is that Levinas's hospitality is chronotopic. It comes back, and in my final sentence, although the text is problematic in political reading, although the text has problems with technicalities
Hello.
and poesis of feminism, I would like to quote a line from that text, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Kathy is saying in her dying breath, I am Heathcliff. अब देखो, self is neither desiring the lost object called other. Self is neither using the other as a petty object A or a substitute gratification. The self is neither naming it as something that should be conquered or colonized or capitalized or consumed. But the self has equated itself with the other, contemporary, co-temporary. I am Heathcliff. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you very much, Dr. Saikat Sarkar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for such an insightful inaugural speech. I think it befittingly sets the tone for today's national webinar. Now, I would like to invite Debashmita Das, a second semester student from the Department of English, to kindly introduce our first resource person. Over to you, Debashmita.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I invite Dr. Ananya Dattagupta to this national webinar via Google Meet platform. She is an associate professor at Vishwabharati. Dr. Ananya Dattagupta is a renowned scholar whose research focuses on the intersections of gender, literature, and cultural studies, with a special emphasis on the works of Rabindranath Tagore. She has been awarded the Visiting Research Fellowship by the Charles Wallace India Trust and Centre for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, Cambridge University. From 21st September 2015 to 15th December 2015. Her recently published book is titled Abhi Bully, The Diary of a Quipster Boy. It came out in 2021. She has published numerous research articles in national and international journals throughout her career. She has made significant contributions to both curricular and extracurricular fields. We are incredibly fortunate to have a renowned expert with us. Her lecture titled Thou Art the Sky and Thou Art the Nest as well. Gender and Kingship, Fluidity in Rabindranath's Gitanjali Song Offering promises to provide a profound exploration of Tagore's masterwork. She will delve into the intricate ways in which Gitanjali portrays the fluidity of gender and kingship, offering fresh perspectives on the themes of identity and relationality in Tagore's poetry. Her insightful analysis will illuminate how Tagore's verses transcend traditional binaries and invite readers to consider more expansive notions of self and connection. Her lecture will not only enhance our understanding of Gitanjali, but also highlight its relevance to contemporary discussions on gender and kinship. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Ananya Dattagupta as she shares her expertise on these fascinating and important topics. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much for that extremely generous introduction, kinder than I deserve. Um, I have to begin with the disclaimer that I am not an academic feminist. I am only recently, if you like, beginning to make, very hesitant, very diffident forays, largely with a view to enhancing my own understanding of the subject. So it's so kind of you to talk about my expertise, but I would like to think that I've come to this session to share some, if you like, incipient ideas and to look to your feedback, look to your responses to further, if you like, nuance my what I see essentially as a work in progress, as a project largely at its inception. Thank you so much again. Let me get on with my paper, my presentation, if you like. Except that there won't be a PPT. You'll have to suffer me speaking. There will be, of course, occasionally perhaps referring a visual referencing of this or that Gitanjali song or poem number. And Dr. Shoikot Sharkar, the convener of this seminar, has very kindly agreed to assist me in that, in getting the slides going. So, let me carry on. Thanks again to everyone who's here to give me a patient hearing. This paper is not a speculation of any kind, as it were, or has no such ambitions to, in regard of Tagore's gender identity as a historical person. It is restricting itself to talking about the identities he assumes, performs, and posits in his lyric self-writing, and the way in which such self-writing may have demanded the plurality and fluidity entailed in the process. Self-writing is a term that I'm using here because Tagore himself, in references to his Gitanjali project, retrospectively talks about how he had sought to give or manifest in those exercises, even in translation for that matter, what he called his true self. So the challenge for him was to convey that or to capture what he saw as an essential self. But then, of course, the idea of the essential self is also something I'll be contesting in my paper. I have restricted myself to his lyric exercises in the English Gitanjali, particularly for the reason that it allows the reader to study his negotiation of gender and kinship and the registers of gender and kinship in a non-vernacular language. I'm consciously doing this. The justification should be cogent, or should be, should or could be perhaps perceived as cogent. If it's not, I hope detractions will be forthcoming. Translation presupposes a degree of conscious choice, notwithstanding Tagore's later disclaimers about accidentality and casualness. That Tagore was acutely aware of the challenges of translating into the radically different language system of English is attested time and again in his recollections. These translated, though autonomous prose lyrics, then afford a fertile case for testing the constructivist dimensions of gender and kinship. Now, the most striking aspect of this fluid constructivism, which is really the thesis I'm trying to offer here, is its recurrence in the lyric structure. the learned speaker who introduced the webinar spoke about Keats, I was reminded constantly of the idea of negative capability, which Keats, as you know, attributes to Shakespeare in the capacity of a playwright who can fashion Iagos and Imogens at will, and therefore, by implication, a prodigiously variegated spectrum of gender and gendered performances. By comparison, the permutations of kinship and gender roles in Gitanjali might seem limited, a finite number of roles, although, as I shall see, of an infinite number of permutations within the framework of those roles, or the dynamic of these roles. The unusualness is, for me, in the lyric voice feeling impelled to create multiple interpersonal scenarios involving the one lone interlocutor, mostly one lone interlocutor, which is the divine. So I'm already, as it were, in rather slippery territory. I'm contesting Tagore's own proposition that he was talking about his own true self, even as I will also make that or a ground for predicating the fluidity that is central to my argument. So the interest, therefore, is also in the personal I and the you stroke he stroke she having to be reinvented, inverted, reversed successively, relentlessly, in fact, in order that the fullness of the relationship may be experienced and conveyed. So it is a lyric which is actually, if you like, or the dramatic that is contained immanently within the lyric form. And if you want to explore Tagore's thoughts, again, somewhat retrospective on the lyric mode, on his own lyric poetry, very interesting. There's some certain extraordinarily, if you like, there's a liminality in Tagore's own thesis later on in 1924. He will separate and differentiate the lyric from the epic mode, but eventually, therefore, also concede that the lyric is itself an extremely versatile and variegated medium for attempting the personal. So the personal here would be should not be misleadingly assumed to be singular. So that is my, if you like, my foundation for arguing that the lyric here is remarkably amenable to the represent or a certain kind of representational fluidity. At this juncture, a methodological rationale on my part and accompanying disclaimers would not be out of place. I ordinarily follow in this lecture the order of the texts in the English volume, despite the alleged randomness, alleged, of course, by a very reliable academic editor, William Radice. So I'm overlooking, as it were, the putative randomness. I am looking at the possibilities of unraveling an internal logic within that ostensible randomness. And I am looking to this subtly strung sequence of contexts, of narratives, of role plays, as we shall see, to argue the inclusivity of the Tagorean imagination and its investment in fashioning almost an infinite range of alterities around certain key principles and tenets. So there are commonalities, mostly political, ethical, and if you like, certain habits of thought. But within that schema, Tagore is prodigiously, as it were, multifarious in his fashionings. This makes for an irreducible variety of contexts and situations and a corresponding multiplicity of permutations of roles and performatives along and across lines of gender, kinship, class, and location. Space would be another way of putting the last of these categories. Ultimately, this proliferation of possibilities where no one relationship structure is replicated, repeated, as it were, even as it is recited through further permutations of disruption, makes for a merger, a collapse of received constructs. So this is where the radicalism of Gitanjali might be located. My submission to this audience then is that this most putatively canonical of Tagore's texts is potentially the most radical. In a paper delivered, usually, as you know, those of you who have studied or who are aware of the critical, if you like, usual critical or authoritative critical opinion around the Tagorean trajectory, you know, Tagore's experimentations are supposed to have begun in a certain way, in a formal aspect, of course, most radically with Bolaka. But I am a little uncomfortable, I've always been, about such, if you like, flippant tendencies in all of us historiographers, if you like, of literature, in respect of persons or authors or entire, you know, the periodicity of literature. I mean, kind of this evolutionary paradigms that we construct. So I would rather be inclined to see the essence of radicalism available to the reader across the spectrum, rather than erupting, however rationally the critic would, as it were, argue at a certain moment through certain cataclysmic, interventions or mediations. So Gitanjali too can be radical, even as it's normally not thought of as being one. In a paper delivered just over a week ago at a different academic venue, I'd argued that Tagore had been more aware and deliberate in his English Gitanjali project than he later gives it out to be. I would like to reiterate that argument in today's paper in the context of the intentionality with which he sets up and or plays off these multiple performative paradigms. That paper had been about Yeats's introduction. My audience here will recall two of the last lyrics in the collection, number 96, which at one point reads, quote, "In this playhouse of infinite forms, I have had my play, and here I have caught sight of him that is formless," as also the ocean of forms, within quotes, my quotes, in the 100th lyric of Gitanjali. Both these quotes or quotations are serviceable if we are trying to, as it were, map the spectrum or the infinity of possibilities that Gitanjali is offering to the reader. Judith Butler will write of her objective in Gender Trouble that only, well, I won't quote all of it, only when the mechanism of gender construction implies the contingency of that construction does, quote, constructedness per se prove useful to the political project to enlarge the scope of possible gender configurations. And I'm trying to, with a lot of trepidation, explore in this paper whether that is also something that's happening in Gitanjali. Tagore's own assertion in number 75 may be cited as ground for arguing the indeterminacy that I'm talking about. The speaker concludes saying, in the indeterminacy of meaning formation in this context. What does the speaker say in that particular lyric? Quote, "From the words of the poet, men take what meaning please them, yet their last meaning points to thee." Clearly the divine addressee. Meaning then is plural. Meaning too is mystic. At the same time, mystic in the sense, or it has, or having, some in a very Benjaminian way, mystic. At the same time, so this meaning is mystic and at the same time self-validating, self-negating, self-consuming. And the ultimate arbiter and addressee combined remains by his very nature impervious to any plea for conclusive, lucid decoding. So neither can we decode with any degree of certitude, nor is the provenance coming from the ultimate addressee any, as it were, does it afford any surety for a stable decoding. Meaning too loses its limits in the being of the unknowable, about whom the poet confesses in number 102 when asked, "Who is he?" "Indeed, I cannot tell." Judith Butler will contend the category of women, and I'm asking you to keep that in mind, how Butler problematizes the category of the essential woman, and suggesting that Tagore might be doing something similar in terms of how he allows the multiplicity of roles and the interactiveness of these roles to problematize the reception of any one meaning in respect of who the person is, who the persons are, the gender identity, and so on, vis-a-vis the protagonists in Gitanjali. So Butler will talk about the category of women as a, quote, permanently available site of contested meanings on the assumption of its essential incompleteness. So that similar kind of deferral of meaning making is strikingly, as it were, present in Gitanjali, if we read it in a certain way, if we read it without the baggage, as it were, of traditional thought. One further disclaimer before I begin to elaborate my readings, at which point I will request Dr. Shorkar to start projecting the PDF. This paper is making no claims for the Tagorean oeuvre in its entirety. Indeed, even the corpus of his poetry is a part thereof. I would be wary of asserting that a similar degree, or I would not assert any similar degree of fluidity underlying his thinking invariably across his other works. Quite the contrary. Tagore is markedly more essentialist in his conceptualization of the feminine in a range of other writings, especially perhaps certain of his prose discourses. My argument, rather, is that the poetics of interiority fundamental to the lyric mode in Gitanjali naturalizes such radical non-essentialism from its author. So this is strictly about Gitanjali. If the psychic is the primal, then in that innermost being, and innermost and being are both words that often recur in Gitanjali, barriers are not just dismantled, barriers are non-existent, they are not pre-existent, Butler would have said also. In other texts, when Tagore differs, he's deferring in all sincerity to social perceptions of conventional gender construct. In Gitanjali, however, he acknowledges the possibility of their erasure. In framing my paper, it's quite obvious by now, I am drawing upon Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. Although I do so with great trepidation, academic feminists might cavil at the readings that I'm making or the parallels that I'm offering. After all, Tagore's use of the universal masculine can itself be confuted for precisely the kind of elisions that Butler and other feminists critique. But one particular section from Butler that would be useful to this exercise, and I quote there, is as follows. The masculine-feminine binary constitutes not only the exclusive framework in which the specificity can be recognized, but in every other way, the specificity of the feminine is once again fully decontextualized and separated off analytically and politically from the constitution of class, race, ethnicity, and other axes of power relations that both constitute identity and make the singular notion of identity a misnomer. So that is really her premise for seeing all gender itself as a performance, as a construct. And that is also my basis for trying to see whether Gitanjali is problematizing the received constructs and whether Gitanjali is reconstructing in plural such identities. Now let's get on with the analysis of particular poems. May I request Shoikot, if it's possible, to
Yes,
take
ma'am.
through? Thank you so much. So I'll start reading because I tend to take a lot of time, but I'm sure having the text in in front of you would be a would be helpful. So I'm beginning with the first poem, Thou Hast Made Me Endless. This itself,
Ma'am, do I need to share the screen now?
yes, please,
Okay.
kindly,
Just
yes.
give me, ma'am, 1 minute, ma'am. Just 1 minute.
Yeah, I'll carry on with the reading while you do so. Thank you so much. No single text could be imagined, as much as this particular poem, number one, that is quite as elusive and shifting in its gender dynamic. The only stability, perhaps in the suggestion of a filial bonding, that too through an insistence on of the diminutiveness of the poet speaker. Right, yes, oh right, yes, thank you so much, yes. Yeah. So the only stability, let me repeat, perhaps is in the suggestion of a filial bonding. So the filial construct, the filial dynamic is the only stable framework. Within that, of course, but then the rest of it is, shifting. And the second one, of course, is an insistence on the diminutiveness of the poet speaker. These very small hands is far from the exact equivalent of ekti muthi. Indeed, it has no correspond. In fact, if I had gone into a juxtaposed analysis or a cross analysis of, Bangla originals, and this would have gone on forever. So I'm, as I said, restricting myself mostly to the English versions and exploring the ambivalences and ambiguities in the received translated edition text as well. So, as I said, ekti muthi has no corresponding phrase in the Bangla original. So it is clearly not translatable as these very small hands. So why the insistence on smallness, therefore, clearly has a point to make about the diminutiveness. Its function is to underline and add to the repetitive use of little in the earlier stanzas and paragraphs. While little is a mark of humility, small is definitely one of size. The word will recur in the superlative degree smallest in number 33, and that there too is an unmistakable qualifier of size. The contrasting qualifiers for the divine addressee in number one, back to number one, I shall tell you when we move on. There will be some cross references to other texts, but more in passing. So we can stay with number one for now, Dr.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
Yeah. So we shall only, yes, and there the words had been, we shall only take the smallest room here. So the contrasting qualifiers, back to number one, for the divine addressee are infinite and immortal, but implicitly carry the idea of vastness and immeasurability. The telescoping and the contrast built upon, or that idea of largeness and the contrasting idea of littleness lends itself to the impression of a filial cradling of a fragile infant. Cradling is maternal. In number 95, the inscrutable without name and form, quotation from Tagore, is conjectured to have taken the poet as if it were he were a suckling infant, quote, in its arms in the form of my own mother. So that is my basis for suggesting that cradling indeed has maternal associations in the Tagorean imagination. Yet, in this case, in number one, the suggestion of a journeying parent carrying the infant over hills and dales wondrously, because it is despite the former, sorry, I lost the plot of the sentence, happens when you're writing into the 11th hour. So the suggestion of a journeying parent carrying the infant across hills and dales seems to point towards or insinuate a disproportionate giganticness, which is nonetheless deeply, deeply careful and vigilant about not causing harm or peril to the infant. The image of the divine then is androgynous, a father-mother or mother-father, and that doubleness, that non-duality will keep recurring in Gitanjali. A similar image of cradling will be discovered later in number 69 of the series, where, quote, the same life is rocked in the ocean cradle of birth and of death, in ebb and in flow. So, one of the ways we can read Gitanjali against the grain, if you like, would be by kind of plotting um the recurrence or non-recurrence also of certain, favored words or terms, and see what kind of a cartography that leads towards it. What kind of a semiotics that ends up blending. So, again, to come back to number one, the heart is said to give birth. Again, a kind of maternal imaginary. The heart is said to give birth and can be safely assumed to take a feminine function, while extraordinarily the touch remains an impregnating one. Such is also later on in the case of, quote, the deep hidden touches of the divine male attributed to the pronoun he, hence divine male in number 72, as also again in the clarity of his touch who is beyond touch in number 97. So, the haptic and the tactile is again a site for a certain constructed non-duality, as we shall see, because it is both corporeal and, if you like, supra corporeal. It is so. Touch can be in a that would be subject of perhaps a different exposition, a different deliberation. But here, therefore, I'm talking about the alternation of the male uh, and the masculine and the feminine. The heart is said to lose its limits, i.e., expand, almost like a pregnant, gestating womb until birthing. Again, the birthing metaphor and trope will recur several times, and more towards the end of our of the text of Gitanjali. As to this little vessel, the receptacle association will return towards the end of the volume at number 90 as a gift for death when he comes calling. So, perhaps I'm being a little Jungian, but vessel, receptacle, um, has perhaps certain immanent associations uh, with birthing and the womb. Likewise, in the image of an endlessly pouring divine, there too, there is an exploration of the other paradigm, the one that I've already broached in terms of the divine masculine. What is brought to mind is an extraordinary union of an infinite giver that has molded the receiver into matching its inexhaustibility. A sacred cosmic communion, such as in Milton's image of the incubating, brooding Holy Spirit, or in the Ovidian union of Uranus and Gaia, is perhaps projected here. No wonder, therefore, that the infant birthed out of this communion is an utterance ineffable. In Gitanjali too, if we may move on, the divine is a connoisseur of the poet's singing skills, and his command may not but be heeded. Yet the command does not come across as harsh or oppressive, for the poet melts in ecstasy on receipt of such a command. And the song of adoration born out of that fusion of the majestic command and the paradoxical effect it has on the malleable being of the poet proves to be a bird that immediately takes flight and in that form reaches the otherwise inaccessible presence of the divine. The song itself is imagined as the wings of that bird, if not the bird itself, and the wings come close enough to actually touch the feet of the divine. So far, the metamorphosis was essentially interspecies and confined to the poet-singer. The unexpected physical proximity, however, though catalyzed by the inseminating force of the divine's command, manages to obliterate for the poet the distance between their stations, so that this relates to the kinship issue that I'm also working into my argument, so that he transgresses in thinking or in addressing the divine as friend who art my lord. Friend in English is a gender neutral salutation that collapses the social hierarchy without clarifying the gender dynamic. A similarly deliberate collapse of the hierarchy of command, as it were, is evident in number 15, when the poet entreats my master to quote, command me to stand before thee to sing, and again to honor me commanding my presence. Friend will return in number 23, this time with the added endearment of the possessive adjective my. In the very next number, number 3, the chasm remains unbridged even as the roles have been reversed. And this is a trend that we may note, over and over again in Gitanjali. So the roles remain the same, but the role play, the performance of the roles is often swapped, reversed, inverted. This time the master has turned master singer, and the poet is his admirer, despairing of ever emulating the former. Here it is the master's song that makes the arduous journey like a cascading waterfall forcing past stony obstacles. In relation to the divine, the poet often presents himself in a passive role. In number 4, the passivity is relative. The poet proposes to keep, can we move to number 4, please? The poet proposes to keep his body pure in response to the living, active touch of the addressee upon it. The prerogative and privilege of touch is here the divine being's, and the anointing is upon all my limbs. However, the poet is not passive in the sense of being immobile or inert. So the usual kind of mind matter, the gendered dichotomy between mind and matter, where mind, as even Helen Sixu points out, is usually associated with the masculine, and the feminine is relegated to the passive sphere or plane of the of matter, is in many ways problematized in this in Gitanjali. So the poet is not passive in the sense of being immobile or inert. Rather, his activity is not reactive or reciprocal in the sense of giving something back by way of touch. Rather, his response is in continuing to receive the touch, to keep his own body worthy of that. Tagore often avoids the economy of barter or exchange because the very point of the relationship with the divine that he projects is that there cannot be any transactional equality. Transaction in the context of Gitanjali is almost sacrilegious. Acceptance and gratitude are not. Humility here also takes on the spatial topos, while in Thou Hast Made Me Endless, number 1, the heart was touched through by the immortal hand of the divine. Here, the divine is seated in the most inmost shrine of my heart, the poet's heart. But this being a seat to the divine does not render the heart impassive. Instead, it converts the prestige and the strength directly infused by the one seated into the labors of revealing him in his glory. So there is reciprocation, but not transaction. Tagore, there's response, but there's no reaction. Tagore might be said to conform to the active passive mind matter masculine feminine binary here along the lines of what Helen Sixu postulates, not to conform. Or conform, however, it is only in terms of, at an ostensible level. It is possible to resist a conformist reading on the premise that neither conceptually nor figuratively does he render the passive into non-agentic or unresponsive as a function or entity. So passive does not translate in the Tagorean paradigm as non-agentic or unresponsive. To be a receiver is not to be non-agentic. So to be feminine is not to be non-agentic. For Tagore, then, it is far from a single binary of active and passive. Reception is a far from passive function. Rather, we may hazard, there's no opposition of roles. Instead, there's a cooperation of two actives, equally invested and committed to the cooperation, but not in mirror roles or in mutually mirroring roles. As we increasingly observe, role swapping as giver-receiver, dominant-subordinate, performer-spectator, doer-waiter is key to this dynamic, in which equity entails readiness to accept the other's efforts. What is operative is a fantasy that subsumes pain and disappointment and renunciation into an affirmative dynamic in the same way as pleasure and fulfillment. Such a fantasy demands a fluidity of approach, a flexibility of imagination for its realization, hence the eagerness to take on alternating kinship and gender roles. The subordination, if we can move to number 5, please. The subordination of the human subject is only circumstantial, not a political imposition from the divine. So that in number 5, the former can ask the divine for a moment's respite from work, and then upon receiving permission, boldly assert the right to, quote, sit quiet face to face with thee. So they are equally agentic, both of them. Yet this placing himself on the same plane and in proximity to the divine, and I believe we can also perhaps apply the Levinasian paradigm, so cogently brought to our notice by my learned colleague who introduced the webinar in this context. So the mutual completing of the, if you like, the complementarity that is imagined. So yet this placing himself on the same plane and in proximity to the divine is not directed towards wresting greater negotiatory leverage. That's not the idea, but so that an intimate setting may be fashioned for the devotee to reiterate his dedication. Number 6, can we carry on? Sees the poet again taking the initiative to steer the relationship while continuing to adhere to the framework of service. Service is a word that he uses. His imperative, less in coercion, more in urgency, reads, delay not. So the poet speaker, the human subject, can also take the prerogative of, if not reprimanding, sensitizing, alerting the divine, should the divine be forgetful of the shall we say, the significance of a particular juncture or a moment or an action. The paradox of this relationship economy is its investment not in return, as in the gratifications afforded by unconditional renunciation. So renunciation in place of return. The non-transactional nature of the bond might mislead us into assuming an anti-mercantile ethos, but the non-transactional basis also resists a feudal framing. So he's steering clear of both. What is envisioned is thus an economy of the commune, I'd like to think, a suspension of any concrete or material profit or benefit. One later formulation, lyric number 79, is characteristically apt in its antithesis. My hands grow full with the daily profits. And then he carries on, I have gained nothing. So profit and gain are not coterminous. Again, in number 89, the poet professes to have taken an untimely break just when men hasten to the king's market. So there's a as you can see, there's a syncopation of the feudal and the market, and urban historians would see it as well, anthropologically spot on. All the buyers and sellers are there. Parallelly, use value is discounted both when it is consciously aspired for, such as, for instance, by the maiden whom the poet implores for her light, even as she uselessly seeks to join the carnival of lamps in number 64. And also, when it's consciously aspired for, it is discounted when it is consciously relinquished, such as in the Wordsworthian number 80, which goes, I'm like a remnant of a cloud of autumn, uselessly roaming in the sky. So use value, either courted or rejected, remains subordinate to non-utilitarian value. Elsewhere too, Tagore betrays a fastidiousness about dissociating joy and fulfillment from utilitarian considerations. What is art, or the meaning of art, is a case in point, because the whole idea of art is seen as a surplus, unhinged from the necessities of existence and survival. Interestingly, in almost all the 5 prose lyrics that we have considered so far, art, particularly music, is the basis and the mode of communication between the divine and the devotee. In number 101, the poet will claim with conviction, ever in my life have I sought thee with my songs. So that's really the foundation of the relationship is aesthetic, or the aesthetic exchange, if you like, which is non-utilitarian. It's entirely volitional. There's no compulsion there. Clearly, then, the poet is determined to forge an alternative, non-transactional, non-utilitarian, non-materialist relational framework for the two parties, in which the shared joy and the larger affective spectrum may be explored, expressed and communicated through musical tutelage, rendition, and mutual appreciation. The privileging of aesthetic exertions over any other form of utilitarian labor is perhaps clearest in number 15, which sees the devotee acknowledge the divine he serves, that, quote, "In thy world I have no work to do. My useless life can only break out in tunes without a purpose." So purpose here is synonymous with the use that we have already discounted. Consonant with the self-sustaining and self-sufficient economy of art, we find in multiple poems an ennui about work and labor, a yearning for respite, if not an abjuration and avoidance altogether, such as in number 5, where he says, "My work becomes an endless toil in a shoreless sea of toil." While we may contest and critique, after feminist theorists such as Siksu, the implied synonymity of authority with the masculine third person pronoun, such as in the apotheotic address, "O Master Poet" in number 7, it is possible also to see it as a translator's bind at odds with the neutrality of its Bangla equivalents. Number 7 does not lend itself to easy gendered categorization. If we could move to number 7, please. The song is decidedly gendered as feminine. So, my song. She, preparing herself and propositioning an amorous union with the divine poet, her lover and groom. Given the seamless transition from my song to my poet's vanity and a little later to I, first person singular, it is difficult to establish a clear relational division between the poet speaker and the song. So the poet speaker is also a she, if you like. It is as though this is performing the she. It is as though the song is an extension of the poet speaker's person, set out for the union, otherwise unfeasible for the person in his entirety. So the person cannot be united except through, as it were, the metonymic or synecdochal, if you like, participation of the song as an extension of his being. The implication then is that either the poet speaker can, Tiresias like, switch gender at will, that is a male subject who can become female, my song in the interest of the union with the master poet, or that the poet conceives himself as feminine insofar as the songster avatar is concerned. One might wonder at the internal logic of the imagery. If this is not a conjugal union, why should the jingle of jewelry pose a special hindrance? So there again, there's no stability of association with the feminine either. So why would there be a jingle of jewelry, as it were, except as a marker of presumption that might not be received well by the master? And if it is indeed conjugal, then clearly, notwithstanding the nature of the relationship, the bride is cast in a submissive stance vis-a-vis the groom, who is envisioned. So there's a hierarchy which is alternately collapsed and reconstructed, who is envisioned as having the transformative genius of making a simple flute filled with music. You know, Gitanjali lyrics are, if you like, very cryptic and in terms of the very dense mixing of metaphors. And that is one of the challenges, as it were, of meaning making here. And that is also what accounts for the fluidity, or that what is also making for the fluidity. The self-subordination then is out of veneration and gratitude. Conjugality will re-emerge in a different paradigm, with the poet speaker as a bride again, and the groom in the person of death. So the role play will take on a different, as it were, version in later on in the text. Number 8, please. It manifests a filial equation, this time with the parent as mother. This is the first time that the mother comes into the dynamic. It is a child deliberating with his mother. His is the pronoun used, with startling authority, where she went wrong in her indulgent show of affection towards her offspring in the forms of adornment and finery. The association, as in number 7, is between femininity and material attachment, such as Siksu would cavil at the stereotyping. However, in both instances, the attachment to the material is not rooted in self-gratification so much as in a desire to please. So a positive spin can be given that cancels the negativity of essentializing the woman as materialist. In a later lyric, the poet speaker will confess embarrassedly to an irresistible attraction for tinsel. So again, he's problematizing the stereotypical equation of the material of materialism or material attachments with the feminine, because that there in numbers 83, the poet speaker is clearly masculine and still confesses an attraction to tinsel, to metal, to precisely the kind of wealth that is disparaged in number 8. Much later in number 83, mother will return rather abstrusely as the custodian of wealth, an unnamed Lakshmi. And Shukanto Chaudhuri actually points out in his in his chapter on Rabindranath's poetics and poetry in the Cambridge Companion to Rabindranath Tagore, that, Lakshmi, surprisingly, extraordinarily, is often the immanent idea of the feminine Jibon Devota that Tagore also incarnates, configures. For instance, in the opening poem of Chitra, that identifying, of course, is by Professor Chaudhuri. In my context, number 83 returns mother. Here the context is domestic and the mother is assimilated into the dynamic of authorial desire. There are then, I read, texts that project a decidedly stereotypical and essentialist feminist roles. The point, even then, is by no means to create a referable standard in terms of which the poet's construct of relationality can be conclusively framed. So the poet is constantly reinventing these tropes, as it were, improvising these tropes. So no conclusive framework of relationality can be established. This is also perhaps, if you like, the challenge of and the fluidity, of and that is posed by the fluidity of constructs. I'm sorry, I'm actually I fumbled a little because I'm trying to keep track of time. There's so much ground that I would have wanted to cover, but I don't suppose I'll have a time. I believe I'll have to end at 11:15, Shoikot?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Right, yes, which leaves me really, really racing for time. I will skip so that I have time to make my most important observations. In number 9, if we could move up, the divine is an all-enduring and forbearing entity, which is not a typical attribute of the authoritative divine. Is fashioned as implicitly feminine, if not maternal. Here, of course, the kinship dynamic is problematized with the intrusion of the word desire, and also parallel accompanying words of self-reproach suggestive of contagion, of uncleanness and unholiness. The admonition seems to be to accept what the giver offers out of love rather than lustily reach out for her gifts. There's an unsettling kind of but I won't go into the incestuous dimensions here because I won't have the time to unravel it. To quote Butler, in its semiotic mode, language is engaged in a poetic recovery of the maternal body, and the fantasy of the maternal body keeps coming back in Gitanjali. And to go on with Butler, and this poetic recovery of the maternal body, quoting, of course, referring to Kristeva's semiotic, diffuses materiality and resists all discrete and univocal signification. So Tagore's, we might speculate whether Tagore's approximation of, or the of the maternal body is a way of trying to escape what would otherwise have been a very repressive university. So that is really what's accounting for the fluidity. Um, well, well. Let me. It would have taken me much longer. I would continue. I would want to move on towards the last bit so that I finish on time. As I have sought to analyze practically in the paper that I'm reading from all the poems, but of course I'll reserve that for some other session. I will, there are poems where he's exploring the heterosexual paradigm. I've talked about the conjugal framework already. There are ones which have homosocial ramifications and explore tensions within a kind of, in a kind of intra-gender dynamic. But I will, as I said, won't have the time to go through all of them. Right. Right. By the time we arrive at number 71, the Tagorean poetics has begun to take shape, precisely because we are compelled to make adjustments to our own earlier readings, even recant and recast them. Have in certain earlier sections, I've been talking about the poetics of, or the anxiety of segregation and separation. But of course, I could not give you those examples. And here, however, an alternative, shall we say, a projection is offered for segregation, not so much as as a split, more as a kind of empowering, unifying, paradoxically, however, and the text is full of such paradoxes. So sorry about being so elliptical. I've skipped a lot of those sections. Let me get to the point. For segregation here is paradoxically a willing act, a severance of the divine self as an act of distribution into many. So the divine segregates itself only in the sense of distributing itself into many, birthing itself into many, in a largely kind of in a reminder of the Neoplatonic paradigm that certain perhaps scholars of Western philosophy or the Renaissance would be able to connect to. So, in many ways, therefore, in segregation, as Tagore understands it, there is actually there's no anxiety of separation. There is actually only a continued connectedness, a continued, as it were, and very organic connection between different spheres of existence, alternately, shall we say, variegatedly imagined as either the divine or the human finite. An equivalent of the Jibun Devota, as I was telling you, is pointed out by Chaudhuri. Again, I will not go into that. The trope will return of birthing will return at number 84, albeit with different ramifications and so on. I would like to argue that this subsuming of a maternal function is not a divesting of the female or a rendering redundant, in other words, so much as it is an absorption of that function. We are back with a man-woman non-duality. This is where I would like to perhaps give over, remarkable for its ability to resist such radical charges of othering and negation as perhaps are leveled by Luce Irigaray. Butler quotes her on page 13. In the concluding image, surreal in its fluidity of not just gender but also kinship roles, a communion has been effected through that very segregation, so that the great pageant of these, thee and me, has overspread the sky with the tune of thee and me. All the air is vibrant, and all the ages pass with the hiding and seeking of thee and me. I believe I have not been printing the whole. I've not managed to print it all, but anyway, I think I have exhausted my time. So I hope I've been able to get my thesis across, although perhaps I have not been able to cite the many examples I would have wanted to. But I would not want to take up more time than required. So let me pause. If there are clarifications sought, I will be happy to provide them when we discuss.
Great. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Anuradi, for such an enlightening talk. Now, I would like to invite the audience. If you have any observations, if you have any questions or queries, please uh, speak to ma'am. Yes, sir, please. Dr. Samazdar, if you have anything to say.
হ্যাঁ, আমি মুগ্ধ হয়ে শুনছিলাম। in in number 7 and number 8, the imagery of adornment or jewelry, and they are taking off the record directly or indirectly. And I was just wondering, as I said in my inaugural address, that contemporaneity of feminisms, or for that matter, any rewriting discursive exercise, be it Marxist or feminist or post-colonial, we don't care, that it is rewriting. So that it is rewriting is progressive. It just dragged my speculations to Highway Stripper by A.K. Ramanujan, in which the shedding of clothes finally relate to the shedding of gender masks that are engineered by society according to Beauvoir, and that are compulsory, necessary, and sometimes deemed sufficient in sociological belonging of dimorphic gendered hierarchies. In number 7 and 8, these imageries of jewelry and taking them off, they recur in several ramifications. And in number 9, the unclean hands, while cleansing would definitely connect on a spiritual and historic level to the cathartic function, and in a psychoanalytic mode to what I would call mourning and washing off, rudali, and to Marxian discourses, the unclean hands of servitude, the unclean hands of master-servant binary opposition, in which the servant should always have unclean hands and the master should always have pure, innocent existence like the lamb of William Blake. These chasms are negotiated very well by Taggart. And I would say that the unclean hands, as opposed to what would be interpreted by Western interpreters as having some kind of class distinctions I just named, or having some kind of racial distinctions. In South Africa, in the apartheid age, the Westerners were allowed to enter into any kind of ghetto restaurant without washing their hands, but the blacks were not. So and Freudian, synecdoche of unclean hands as hands that cannot wash off the guilt, the loss, the melancholy, the uncatharticized hands. In number 9, these are very well negotiated by Taggart, because what I feel is that in number 7 and number 8, the adornment, the jewelry that are there and that are taken off is not a gesture of subjection, but of subject formation. A
Exactly.
subject, and in the unclean hands in number 9 do not point to tropological signifiers of bereavement, marginalization, and guilt, but unclean in the sense of uh, the sovereignty of bareness, the sovereignty of naturalness, the sovereignty of uh, what to say, the sovereignty of being in immediate, without mediation, contact with nature. So I think in number 9 there is some kind of ecofeminist possibility, and number 7 and number 8 there is some kind of possibility of the female bodies and therefore female cognitions, female existences, extra resources which finally shouldn't be taken off, which finally shouldn't be surrendered, which finally shouldn't be disrobed until and unless the jewelry and the mask are supplied by and imposed by patriarchy. So this was my intervention, actually not a question. I just spoke because I was excited by the quality of the talk.
Thank you for your kind words. I learned a lot from your insights. I was going to point out, well, I bit off more than I could chew because, as I said, I mean, this is not a text that I could have ever aspired to do justice to in an hour-long talk, even as I completely acknowledge and express my gratitude for the time that the organizers have allocated for me. There are, as I was talking about role swapping, there is, I cannot exactly give you the number, but well, in the same way in which unholiness seems to be disparaged but the example that you cited, conversely, it is being holy. It is the antiseptic nature, as it were, of institutional um, religiosity that is disparaged, and what is privileged over that is the need to for the holy to if you like to unclean itself, to mingle with the earth in a kind of trope that keeps recurring in the Tagorian pedagogy, in the Tagorian ethos of how, for instance, very romantic perhaps, how the child should be brought up and the kind of experiential opportunities that ought to be provided to a child. So somewhere the holy man should become a child again, and a child who unfetters himself from the sanitized, if you like, exclusivity of a of maternal secure maternal care. In fact, that is the point of the reprimand in the poem that you're citing, and should actually there's an imperative for the child, that the child itself seems to be, as it were, voicing, to come out and join the common humanity, the common current of life, and and uh, and dust and dirt and footstool are recurrent images of a kind of voluntary subalterning of oneself, in the necessity of both uh, finding common ground with one's fellow humans, and also perhaps uh, you know enter into a triangulated communion with with the divine, because the divine himself is not to be found within the sanctified shrine of religiosity, but instead among the poorest of the poor, the poorest and the lowliest, to cite Tagore's own words. So the holy, the rejection of uncleanness itself again is reversed in another text. So this is the elusiveness of Tagore. There's the successive texts keep cancelling their own constructed tropes. This is one of the ways in which Gitanjali is, as it were, creating a very elastic spectrum of possibilities. You can carry on. That's just my humble response to your observations, sir.
থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাম। ইফ ইউ হ্যাভ এনি কোয়েশ্চেন্স ফ্রম দ্য অডিয়েন্স, আমাদের সঙ্গে যুক্ত হয়েছেন ডক্টর নাফিসা ইসলাম, সহযোগী অধ্যাপক, বাংলা বিভাগ, লালগোলা কলেজ। ম্যাম, আপনি যদি কিছু বলেন তাহলে আমাদের খুব ভালো লাগবে। ম্যাম, ওভার টু ইউ। ওকে, আমাদের সঙ্গে রয়েছেন সুদেব দা। সুদেব দা, ইফ ইউ হ্যাভ something to say, please go ahead.
I would like to go on record to say that without Shudev's cooperation, given the challenges, it's been a rather challenging week, and particularly the past couple of days. Without his active support, I would not have been in a position to join and to offer my talk today. So I would like to record my gratitude.
Thank you, Shoykot. Thank you, Ananya. It's just that, as you can well understand, I'm the strong silent type. And quoting from somebody called a certain John Milton, they also serve who stand and wait.
There's an only there. There's an only there. And an only that Tagore very, very strategically uses in a bit to kind of create a very unique solipsistic space where he can explore these dimensions of interiority, where the fluidity of roles and kinship formations can be, problematized. So that singularity is created in order that within that paradigm he can endlessly explore and subvert different, the fixed permutation of what it's like to be a human subject vis-a-vis and a devotee vis-a-vis the divine. So they also serve who only stand and wait may have been often on his mind.
I can see Priyadarshini Chakraborty has raised her hand. Ma'am,
Yes.
if you would like to say something, please go ahead.
প্রচন্ড ধন্যবাদ, এত সুন্দর সমৃদ্ধ একটা আলোচনা। ম্যামকে অনেক ধন্যবাদ। ইংরেজি সাহিত্যের সঙ্গে বাংলা, রবীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুর, জীবন দেবতা, আমি মুগ্ধ হয়ে শুনেছি। পরে হয়তো আর অবকাশ হবে কিনা জানি না, তবে এরকম আয়োজন যেন সৈকত আরো করে এবং শোনার অবকাশ দেয়। ম্যাম, আপনাকে অনেক ধন্যবাদ। এত সুন্দর উপস্থাপনা, আর এভাবে ইংরেজির সঙ্গে বাংলা, রবীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুর, জীবন দেবতা, এত সুন্দর, কি বলবো আপনাকে, ধন্যবাদ না জানিয়ে পারছি না।
আপনাকে আমার নমস্কার, সশ্রদ্ধ এবং কৃতজ্ঞতা। আমি অভিভূত আপনার কথা শুনে।
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Anyone from the audience, if you have any questions or queries, please go ahead. Okay, ma'am, I have a question. You have referred to song number 96, and you talked about, I'm just quoting from the text, in this playhouse of infinite forms, I have had my play, and here have I caught sight of him that is formless. So would you please kindly elaborate on the term formless in this context?
I think not that I wasn't thinking about it. I think the formless is to project the divine as, first of all, let me clarify that again, this is not the only way. This would not be the only way in which Tagore might be said to have conceptualized the divine. In the religion of man, the dyad of being the human seeker, and vis-a-vis the as it were the immortal Paramatta, I think is more clearly laid out, more clearly paved. So the formlessness, if you like, is something that he seems to be admitting of as a possibility, and an empowering one, only in the context of the Gitanjali. And I'd like to argue, in order that he can then uh, uh, take on the prerogative as a poet crafter, if you like, as a mind, in complicity with the divine, to 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 configure multiple different incarnations of that formlessness. So I think the play element in the relationship, as the poet speaker repeatedly kind of hints at, or reiterates within the Gitanjali kind of divine devotee, God, uh, uh, poet dynamic. The play element is largely about the creativity that is entailed in giving form to the formless. You will remember, I'm sure, Shoikot, that in English translation is the creator of forms. There's a particular essay by Tagore. So I think the whole artistic, if you like, function, and which is so fundamental to the exchange that I was talking about, the nature of the exchange, the nature of the the co-participation in Gitanjali between the divine and the human. In that artistic imperative is to be able to playfully, in collusion, through co-creations, uh, see multiple, or imagine or configure multiple ways of reimagining the human relationship and relationality to the divine, and to use that multiplicity not so much as a kind of integrated, comprehensive, tightly knit, rigidly and rigorously kind of imposed, institutionalized kind of format, but more as a freedom that is in a way central to taking on that artistic function, or central to participating in this artistic exchange. The whole idea is that to be with God is to therefore engage in the creative play of imagining one another, the divine in relation to the devotee, and the devotee in turn. So this is a play that the divine is equally participating in, equally invested in. So it's a mutual and an endless process of mutual imaginings. But of course, since we do not directly experience divine articulation, it is possible to say that it is the artist's and the poet's prerogative, within the confines of human language, to refract what is seen, or what the poet is anxious to present as a co-creation. So whether it is music, whether it is the very kind of spectrum of sculpted forms, verbally sculpted forms that we encounter. So none of this is entirely, the poet would want us to believe, the creation, the sole exclusive creation of the poet. It is all emerging out of the extremely fruitful communion a communion that has no essential rupture, even as there may be occasional absences, there may be withholding, there may be certain, as it were, pauses, there may even be silence. But through all this affective spectrum, through the negotiation of different kind of ontological alternatives, through all of that, there is never actually, in the Tagorean understanding, an absence of the divine. And therefore, the divine is always imagined as a co-participant in this creative process. And this creative process is about continuously, as it were, projecting forms in a way to approximate to the formlessness without substituting it. So forms don't exist in order to do away with or to cancel the formlessness. The formlessness is a reality. The forms are equally realities. So again, a kind of, this is not the Platonic metaphysics where the formlessness is invariably always privileged over the forms. Tagore is not one to reject the plane of appearances, which he would have normally seen as manifest in nature. Tagore is looking at the possibility of inhabiting both spheres, both planes. So there is formlessness that is equally real, but there is also the possibility of imagining forms and of imagining alternative realities. So on that, so there's one article in this context that by Bikash Chakraborty, called Robindranath Romantic Epiphany, Robindranath Romantic Epiphany, where I've been thinking very much about that quotation of late, where Rabindranath is supposed to have said that something may not be visible, but its in non-visibility does not render it unreal. So reality, so concreteness and reality are not, as it were, synonymous. So something can exist in the abstract, formless, if you like, and still be real. So we have the possibility of multiple coexistences where there are forms and not just one singular form, but there's also the singularity of the formless beyond.
Thank you, ma'am. So
সৈকত আর একজনের প্রশ্ন আছে আমি দেখতে পেয়েছি, কিন্তু আগে তুমি যে প্রশ্নটা করেছো তাতে আমি একটু তোমার এবং অবশ্যই অনন্যার অনুমতি নিয়ে একটু ইন্টারভিন করছি। হ্যাঁ, সেটা হচ্ছে যে এই যে 96 গান বা সং 96, সেখানে দুটো ইভেন্ট বা দুটো ঘটনা উল্লিখিত হয়েছে। এক, জুদাই, বিদায়, সেপারেশন, আর দুই, ফর্মলেসনেস, যেটা নিয়ে অনন্যা বলল এবং যেটা নিয়ে তোমার প্রশ্ন ছিল। তো এবার ঘটনা হচ্ছে যে যেটাকে আমরা তাত্ত্বিকভাবে বলে থাকি জুই সস, when I and you were together, to quote Kamala Das, we were neither male or female. আনন্দময় কোষ বলে ইন্ডিয়ান এপিস্টেমোলজিতে যে স্টেজটাকে কল্পনা করা হয়, বা জুইসস বলে যেটাকে পোস্ট ফ্রয়েডিয়ান থটে ওয়েস্টার্ন মেটাফিজিক্স কল্পনা করেছে, সেখানে ফর্মস এর ডিভিশন এবং ফর্মস এর পলিটিক্যাল হিয়ারোস আইকন বা হায়ারার্কি, এগুলো সব ঘুচে যায়। তার কারণ হচ্ছে সেটা একটা প্লাবনে আপ্লুত হওয়ার মতো, আনন্দে আসে। সেখানে বিরহেও আনন্দ, সেখানে মিলনেও আনন্দ। তো 96 নাম্বার গানে দেখা যাচ্ছে যে কতগুলো সিগনিফায়ার কিন্তু খুব হাইলাইটেড। একটা হচ্ছে প্লে হাউস, অর্থাৎ একদিক থেকে দেখতে গেলে অভিনয়, একদিক থেকে দেখতে গেলে ফোর্ট ডা বা খেলা, একদিক থেকে দেখতে গেলে আজ খেলা ভাগার খেলা। আরেকটা সিগনিফায়ার সবসময় ফর্মের পাশে, ফর্ম নামক শব্দটার পেছনে অথবা আগে কিছু প্রিফিক্স বা সাফিক্স, কিছু উপসর্গ বা পরসর্গ যোগ করেছেন রবীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুর। যেমন ধরা যাক, ফর্মস এর ক্ষেত্রে বলেছেন ইনফাইনাইট ফর্মস বা ফর্মলেস, অর্থাৎ ফর্ম জিনিসটাকে তিনি কিন্তু অতিক্রম করার কথা বলেছেন। অনন্যা যে রেসপন্ডটা করলো তোমার প্রশ্নে, সেটাতে মোটামুটি উজ্জীবিত হয়ে, অনুপ্রাণিত হয়ে আমি এই কথা বলছি। মাই হোল বডি অ্যান্ড মাই লিমস হ্যাভ thrilled with his touch, who is beyond. বিয়ন্ড কি? কোন হরাইজনের বিয়ন্ড? কোন দিগন্ত রেখা অতিক্রম করে সে বিয়ন্ড? বিয়ন্ড দ্য সেন্স অফ the sovereignty of self, beyond the hubris or the unnecessary pride of the subject, beyond the complacency of those who sit in the sty of contentment. ম্যারিনা টি.এস. এলিয়ট। অর্থাৎ এক কথায়, ইগো বাউন্ডারি গুলোকে যদি ঘুচিয়ে দিতে পারে একজন, কে জন কিটস আর কে স্প্যারো, কে শেলি আর কে ওয়েস্টউইন্ড, ব্লো থ্রু মি, মেক মি দাই লায়ার। আমি কে? আমি কিছুই না, আমি একটা ইনস্ট্রুমেন্ট, আমি একটা জিনিস যেমন তুমি একটা জিনিস, আমি একটা ফোর্স যেমন তুমি একটা ফোর্স। আমি আমার ইগো বাউন্ডারি খুলে দিলাম। আমার মনে হয় যে এই সং নাম্বার 96-এ রবীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুর সেই ইগো বাউন্ডারি গুলোকে খুলে দেওয়ার কথা বলেছেন। ইগো বাউন্ডারি খুলে দিলে ফর্ম উইল বি ফর্মলেস, definite will be indefinite, and ego will become hospitable to the other, inviting the other. আদার এবং সেলফের মধ্যে যে ব্যবধান, সেটা ঘুচিয়ে ফেলার জন্য, যেহেতু আজকের তাত্ত্বিক অভিধা আলোচনার হচ্ছে নুয়ান্সেস অফ কন্টেম্পোরারি ফেমিনিস্ট থট, সেই প্রেক্ষাপটে বলছি যে এটা খুব জরুরি অনুধাবন করার যে রবীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুর এখানে কিন্তু আনন্দ উপভোগ থেকে আলাদা করতে পেরেছেন, ফর্মকে ফর্মলেসনেস থেকে পৃথক করেননি, ফর্মলেসনেসকে একটা উন্নততর ফর্ম হিসাবে কল্পনা করেছেন, যেখানে আই নামক ফর্মটা ঘুচে যায়, মি নামক ইম্যাজোটার মিথ্যা অভিপ্রেরণ ঘুচে যায়, এবং তারপর আই এবং ইউ এর মধ্যে যে ব্যবধান বা সেলফ অ্যান্ড আদারের মধ্যে যে বাইনারি অপোজিশন বা সাবজেক্ট এবং অবজেক্টের ভেতরে যে দ্বিঘাত অসমীকরণ, সেটাও ঘুচে যায়। তো আমার মনে হয় সনেট, এই যে সনেট বলছি, আমি ইংলিশ পড়াই বলে সনেট শব্দটা বেরিয়ে এলো, আমারই ভুল। সং নাম্বার 96-এ বা গীতাঞ্জলি নাম্বার 96-এ ফর্মলেসনেসের যে তাৎপর্য, সেটা হচ্ছে বেসিক্যালি হায়ারার্কিকে ঘুচিয়ে ফেলা, ডিফারেন্সকে রেসপেক্ট করা। আমি এইটুকুই বললাম। খুব ভালো লেগেছে অনন্যার প্রেজেন্টেশন এবং রেসপন্স।
Thank you, sir. So this is the final question which we take for this session. We are running behind of time. So Shubhankar Bhattacharya has a question. Sir, please go ahead.
Can you hear me, Anandadi? Yeah, I've just switched on my camera. I found that so incredibly rich. I mean, just goes without saying. And I always think when I read Tagore, that he was so incredibly open and capacious and vertiginous as a thinker, that Tagore critics, even some of the best of them, have got sort of tied up in knots sometimes, responding to his thought. I just had one question, which, forgive me if it's slightly elliptical to the general tenor of your presentation, but I think will be of some import to the theme of this conference. It was triggered in me by that reflection you made about Manushi. and how Tagore becomes formally more ingenuous. That critics have attributed a certain degree of formal ingenuity to him from Manushi. And I think Shukanta Chaudhary, whom you invoked in your essay, also quotes from the same Buddhadev Boshu essay, which I was thinking of, where Buddhadev Boshu makes averse to the same conclusions that from Manushi to Bolaka is actually Tagore's most formally sort of brave and ingenuous phase, if you will. And you were actually saying that no, Tagore has formally been ingenuous from Gitanjali and maybe even before that. So I just had one very basic provocation for you, which you could, if you could kindly unpack for us. So if from Gitanjali we see Tagore as formally dexterous and ingenuous, is there a dialectic then we can unpack between gender and genre? You know, this kind of formlessness was discussed in such great detail that I lapsed to it almost unconsciously. But this kind of traffic between form or genre and gender. I mean, I was thinking of The Waiting Woman, Jibon Devota, etc. Things that you have covered in great detail and things that you could not because of constraints of time. So if you could help us think through or expatiate on this within Gitanjali specifically. I mean, not to restrict yourself to that and not Tagore's entire oeuvre, the sort of the commerce or the dialectic between gender and genre. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. When I critique the developmental kind of paradigm, usually that is kind of Tagore's, corpus as a whole is located within, where at certain junctures he responds to, the certain kind of environmental catalysts in the form of what is, perhaps visits to visits abroad, association with shall we say, literary, artistic, progressive literary, artistic, and literary and artistic minds, and therefore that how he kind of reinvents his own art. He reinvents, he lends himself to, or shall we say, kind of he refashions himself as at certain junctures as more insistently experimental than he would perhaps otherwise have been. So that's usually the way in which Tagore's kind of an evolutionary paradigm, something that perhaps Tagore himself has. I mean, that's one of the hazards of being a very, very prodigious thinker. You provide in many ways the paradigms that you are then located within. So the evolutionary paradigm I was talking about, the religion of man text, is already, as it were, present in Tagore, and therefore we would tend to kind of locate Tagore's own trajectory as in terms of that same kind of cartography of becoming. But my point was to try and this is something that I've tended to point of view that I have tended to have through my very perhaps fitful explorations of the Tagorean corpus, which is that he is he is perpetually experimenting. For him, I think he's the most I believe that it is impossible for a text not to be transgressive. Every text is almost by definition a transgression of the form that it is, that it participates, that it reconfigures. So every reconfiguration of a form by a text is transgressive. And Tagore, given a certain kind of, I think it is particular to Tagore, kind of if you like, philosophical restlessness, his inability to, or his refusal to see himself straitjacketed within any one definitive, creative kind of topos, that he's insistent on being experimental. So he's insistently, as it were, porous in terms of constantly, kind of pervasively, insistently absorbing multiple, sometimes contrary influences. So that is something that was always already there in the Tagorean text. So it is difficult. So even as, of course, there are reasons to identify one, but some text or another, be it within the dramatic oeuvre or the poetic oeuvre, as marking kind of watersheds or turning points. If it is possible to see Tagore as irrepressively, as it were, um, experimental. So by that logic, and I think it is more important to see how ideas, in a kind of thesis that I've been trying to offer in the context of Gitanjali, there is always a repetition only through modification. So if there is so every paradigm for Tagore is something that uh, affords a foundation for inversion, for subversion in successive texts, sometimes texts that keep recurring across his entire career. So that so Gitanjali maybe I am taking issue with the you for instance, Radice also does that, and I'm of course also fundamentally critiquing the Yeatsian oversimplification and essentialization of the or exoticization of the Tagore poems as simple. I'm problematizing this kind of very damaging kind of verdict of uh, of uh, of, if you like, accessibility that Gitanjali has tended to have in the West. I think I am suggesting that Gitanjali, the English translation, is offering Tagore another playful a scope to challenge and tease the Anglophone reader into acknowledging a much more elastic paradigm, such as the professor was suggesting a little while back, that in terms of how there can be overlaps with jouissance without actually being an synonymity with any Western paradigm, because in a way, to understand the Tagorean experimentation, we have to perhaps also keep in mind the inherent um, if you like, what do you call that? The performative paradigms received from the ancient Hindu tradition, even for that matter, the Natya Shastra tradition, the performative, multiple performative, the taxonomy offered there.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
well, not just the rasas, in terms of how the rasas then multiply and you know se- and um, and open up a staggering range of affective performances. So the rasas are only the, if you like, the simplest and the most rudimentary of elements in that, components in that taxonomy. So the inter or the habitation of forms, even artistic forms, is already uh, a presence in the Indian tradition, and it is on and Tagore is then perhaps effecting a wonderful cross pollination with his exposure to similar ideas of transgressiveness in genre and form, and and in the process he's engendering new forms in the interest of exploring the essential fluidity and non-singularity of his thoughts. So there, that is where the gender connection comes comes into play. If in order that gender fluidity and kinship fluidity may be um, posited or experimented with, the form too must be expanded exponentially, and vice versa. So there's a chiastic connection there. The fluidity is because of uh, the the formal elasticity, and the fluidity of the relational fluidities in terms of their gender ramifications or their kinship ramifications also follow from the necessary or the imperatives of formal experimentation, so that he, so this perhaps there's a, I don't know, this cannot be seen as totalizing. Far from it. I would not see this as totalizing in any way in its aspiration. Rather, I would see it as inclusive. It is what the feminine écriture, that, or the écriture féminine, that our learned colleague was talking about. So that is where that is where gender and form, gender and genre might be said to be co-creating the Tagorean, the 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 suppleness of Tagorean art.
Okay, thank you,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
I'm sorry for
Thank you.
intervening. We're running behind. Thank you
Yes,
so much,
absolutely.
ma'am, for
Yes,
your such an enlightening talk. Thank you
thank
so
you so
much.
much.
Now
Thank you.
we'll move on to the next session. Now I
Yes.
would like to invite Shushmita Banerjee, the final semester student of the Department of English, to kindly introduce our next resource person. Over to you, Shushmita.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a distinct honor for me to introduce Dr. Himjyoti Medhi in this national webinar via Google Meet platform. She is an associate professor of English at Tezpur University. Dr. Medhi is a renowned scholar in the fields of women's writing and the women's movement. Her research interests lie in gender and literature, women's movements, and oral history. Her academic contributions have greatly enriched our understanding of the intersections between literature and gender studies. She has received Charles Wallace Trust Fellowship for 2014 to 2015. Dr. Medhi's book, Gendered Publics, Chandraprabha Shaikhini and the Mahila Shamitis in Colonial Assam, published in 2023, delves deeply into the narratives crafted by women. It explores how these texts reflect, challenge, and shape societal norms. Her work not only highlights the voices of women writers, but also examines the broader implications of their contributions to the literary canon and the ongoing women's movement. One of her significant articles, titled In Search of Our Mothers' Guidance, encourages us to reconsider traditional literary frameworks and to appreciate the unique perspectives offered by women's writing. Today, she will share her expertise on reading women's writing and the women's movement, a topic that is both timely and critical. Her lecture promises to offer profound insights and stimulate meaningful discussions on the power of women's narratives and their role in advocating gender equality. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Himjyoti Medhi. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Sushmita Banerjee, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to Dr. Saikat Sarkar, I'm here. Thank you to the head of the department and the Vice Chancellor of CBPU. I was so engrossed in Ananya ma'am's talk that, I almost forgot that I also have to present next. Uh, Let me clarify right in the beginning that mine is not really an academic paper, because when Dr. Sarkar contacted me, he sent me the syllabus of of the university for English, and 2 papers he sent, and he suggested that I pick on one of the topics that the students read. So mine is going to be more in terms of an introductory lecture for students, because the teachers already know what I'm going to say. So may I request Dr. Sarkar to share the slides from your end, so that or
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
I
ma'am.
yeah, because sometimes I can try doing that as well, but sometimes there is a problem with. Should I try doing it? You can tell me if I'm being able to share, and then you can uh, let me know.
Share it, ma'am. I think it is visible. Is the
Okay.
slide visible, everybody?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So then, so with thanks to the Professor Datta Gupta. In fact, to carry on from there, I think Professor Bhattacharjee asked the question about gender and genre, and I was remembering Arjun Appadurai and I think Frank Commode and J. Mills' edited book, Gender, Genre, and Power in South Asian Expressive Traditions, where A.K. Ramanujan has this very interesting essay about women's tales. And of course, I haven't read extensively Tagore's Gitanjali, but I was wondering if Ramanujan's take on, and when he says genders are genres, and that's a quotation from Ramanujan's essay in that book, if it would be also applicable to some of the ideas that Tagore has to offer in Gitanjali. So without further ado, today my title is, the talk is titled as Reading Women's Writing and Women's Movements, an Introduction to Feminist Theory. So like I mentioned, it's more for the students rather than for teachers, because I'm sure, teachers already know much of what I'm saying. So the brief overview is that it's divided into three parts, the talk. The first part would give an introduction to feminist theory. The second part is a reading of Charlotte Perkins's Yellow Wall paper. And the third part, where I kind of draw a connection to uh, madness and the idea of women's agency from my own research work of archival material of Mahila Samiti's documents, which we curated as part of a digital archive, in colonial and late colonial Assam. So I'll start with the first part. So in fact, I'm so glad when the learned professor head of the department started by saying feminism/feminisms, because unlike many of the theoretical schools like Marxism, post-colonialism, deconstruction, you can add, we do not necessarily think of founding fathers/mothers in feminism. And why is that so? Because feminist consciousness is something that is not necessarily theorized or articulated by one single person at a given point of time. There has been many diverse articulations of feminist consciousness across centuries, or you could say across the millennia. And because of that, we don't necessarily go to specific beginning, and therefore it's always difficult to think of feminism or feminisms as having one particular beginning from where we draw a line or descendants. And this also kind of takes us back to the talk that ma'am was delivering in the morning about multiple possibilities of not a totalizing kind of narrative. So I'm trying to also kind of draw from that and suggest that the way we understand feminisms is not a totalizing narrative, but diverse expressions of feminist consciousness across the globe, across cultures and civilizations, and across time and space. So when you think of multiple origins, and there's this wonderful book, and I'm sure the teachers already know about it, but some of the students may have also read it. These 2 volumes edited by Suji Tharu and K. Lalita, Women's Writing in India, Volume 1 and 2. Excellent collection of women's writing across the millennia. And I think many of us were made aware of the Therigathas or the Buddhist Therigathas verses of the elder nuns, at least I was made aware of such a powerful, presence of or traditions of feminist consciousness in our own part of the world through their book. And the Buddhist Therigatha or verses of the elder nuns, there are also verses of the elder bhikkhus, which the male devotees, which are called a Theragatha. So Therigatha is necessarily gendered; it is by the nuns, and these are roughly 73 poems. Now there are disputes, of course, about the numbers. I mean, if something is going on since as early as 6th century BC and has been orally passed on, and only later on written down in Pali language, you could well imagine that how much of it is retrieved and how much of it is actually lost, right? So I just want to, quote one verse from there to see what does it say, what does that consciousness say. So it's on the slide. So freed, so thoroughly freed am I, from three crooked things set free, from mortar, vessel, and crooked old husband. Having uprooted the craving that leads to becoming, I'm set free from aging and death, unquote. Now, of course, I'll come back to mortar and pestle later on, which of course refers to domesticity and domestic work. And the students, of course, you'd realize that when this particular bhikkhuni suggests that I'm set free from aging and death, it's not about the materiality of aging and death, like the reference to Tagore, like ma'am was saying, the idea of reality is not something that is just visible. So of course the body would die, the material body would decompose, but in soul that she has been set free, and she's been set free so thoroughly. This, I believe, is an expression of feminist consciousness. And there has been a lot of work done on how these expressions were important for the shaping of early Buddhism, by these elder nuns. Now, as I said, I'll have to do multiple bits and pieces of origins, because we do not have time to kind of go over each and every of these, whereas each and every one of these writers are interesting in their own way. Now, the next set of writers that I've chosen are Christine de Pizan or Pisson or Anne-Marie Wollstonecraft. Now, many of us know Christine de Pizan for her two books, primarily the Book of the City of Ladies and the Treasure of the City of Ladies. And she came again to our kind of awareness, partly because Beauvoir, while writing The Second Sex, celebrated her work, and I quote, as the first time we see a woman take up her pen in defense of her sex. So if you look at the dates of Christine de Pizan, then we are in the late 14th and early 15th century, and there to articulate a kind of consciousness which goes beyond. And she was a prolific writer. She was a celebrated court poet and writer. So that work itself, sometimes the articulation in writing itself becomes a radical act of subversion. And when we come to Yellow Wallpaper, that's exactly what we'll see. Next again is, now these are, I have put them chronologically, but we are all aware that there's so many that I'm missing in between, right? And because we cannot kind of go in between, of course, there would be between the 15th and the 18th century where Mary Wollstonecraft is. There's this entire tradition of bhakti poetry, of Meera bhajans in India and other kinds of, bhakti poetry in different parts of India where women articulate a certain kind of subjectivity as well. So Mary Wollstonecraft, who, and I'd like the students to, because they have been very quiet, if you'd like to respond to who is the famous daughter that she has had, and why do we remember her daughter for? Just like a little quiz for the students. I hope the teachers will not answer, because everyone knows, just to kind of get us out of our sense of stupor, because it can be quite tiring to keep sitting. Mary used
Ma'am,
to.
Mary Shelley, she is
Yes.
remembered for Frankenstein.
Yes, excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you. So, in fact, Mary Wollstonecraft died while, immediately after giving birth to Mary Shelley, and it's a family which is unique, right? Like Godwin, Mary Shelley's father was a radical himself, and Wollstonecraft came from a family who were not very rich, and she worked as a governess, carer, traveled widely, went to France, and as you can see from the dates, she lived through much of the time of the French Revolution. And when Edmund Burke, and I'm sure all of you have read this as part of your history of literature, in 1790 attacked the French Revolution, and the ideology behind it, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a defense, within a month of the publication of Burke's pamphlet, and there was like a pamphlet war, and she wrote a vindication of the rights of men. And soon after her, Tom Paine wrote the book called Rights of Men. And when this was going on in 1791, Wollstonecraft felt that somewhere none of these discussions really addressed the question of women. So in 1792, which is often celebrated as one of the first texts in English to clearly state and to celebrate the rights of women, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote and published that. So this is an important moment for us in the Western canon, so to say. Now, again, I'm skipping the entire 19th century in India, where many of the major reformers talked about, women, address the women's question in the liberal mode, in the radical mode, but I'm skipping that. And because we're moving towards literature, I just want to briefly, mention Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain, who was a phenomenal woman educator, a philanthropist, and who wrote this very interesting tale called Sultana's Dream, and it was published in 1905. And I'm sure some of you have already read it. What Sultana's Dream did as the mode of the science fiction, because remember, it was kind of not very, science fiction was not something, or speculative fiction was not something that was very, very easily, articulated or practiced in India at that time. And when she wrote this, and it was published in the Indian Ladies magazine in 1905, she actually turned the table upside down. So instead of the zenana, where women would sit and sew, in Ladyland, the zanana would have men, doing sewing and sitting down. And there's an excellent satirical take on why, and her, of course, her aim at the time is to convince for women's education, and that's what she's aiming at. I'll just move through two more, major writers, or theorists who have contributed so substantially to feminist understanding of women's writing. One is, of course, Virginia Woolf. All of us read her as part of our syllabus, and she has this. Woolf has this long essay called A Room of One's Own, published in 1929, which was delivered as a set of lectures in two women's colleges. And I'd like the students to read this particular quote in order to, so we are aware how Woolf actually talks about the whole idea of, could we have a woman in Shakespeare's time who was as talented as Shakespeare, writing plays as Shakespeare did? And she imagines a character. This is an imaginary character of Shakespeare's sister, Judith Shakespeare. And she imagines a life of Judith Shakespeare. So even if you haven't read the entire Room of One's Own, please do read that section on Judith Shakespeare, because it's so amazingly, Woolf imagines how a woman who was equally talented and genius like Shakespeare would never have had the opportunity to travel, to train, to educate herself, and to actually really land up in the playhouse and write plays. She'd often, even if she ran away from home, she'd end up with the theater manager, get pregnant, and die. Or maybe who's buried in the elephant in the thing crosswords that Ulf says. So Ulf is trying to articulate that how are women represented in fiction and how do women live. So the dichotomy between what was the reality of women's lives and how women were represented. So if you read this particular quote, and I'll read slowly. Women have burnt like beacons in all the works of all the poets from the beginning of time. Indeed, if woman had no existence save in the fiction written by men, one would imagine her a person of the utmost importance, very various, heroic and mean, splendid and sordid, beautiful and hideous in the extreme, as great as a man, some would say greater. But this is woman in fiction. In fact, as Professor Travlin points out, Travlin is the one who has written a famous history of England, so she refers to Travlin's work. She was locked up, beaten, and flung about the room. A very queer composite being thus emerges. Imaginatively, she is of the highest importance. Practically, she is completely insignificant. She pervades poetry from cover to cover. She is all but absent from history. She dominates the lives of kings and conquerors in fiction. In fact, she was the slave of any boy whose parents forced a ring upon her finger. Some of the most inspired words and profound thoughts in literature fall from her lips. In real life, she'd hardly read, scarcely spell, and was the property of her husband. So this was true right up to the 18th and the 19th century for much of the women that Ulf is writing about. So in a way, what Ulf is trying to articulate that there's a vast difference between how women are and if she refers to Cleopatra and Juliet and Millamant and all these great women characters that we see and read in literature, as opposed to what Professor Travlin, and in fact she refers to this book of History of England, and that the only indices where she found women were wife beating and husbands. So women were referred to in that entire history. So women are completely silenced from that historical inquiry altogether. And she laments that why is it that despite having generations of mothers and their mothers and their mothers and their mothers, why the absolute poverty of our kind, she says, why is it that there is not a single women's college till the 19th century? There is no education being offered, there is no fellowship. I mean, she asks all these important questions. And eventually, of course, the conclusion is that if a woman wants to write fiction, because fiction is something that hardly paid when Ulf was writing, then she needs £500 a year and a room of her own, meaning that if you need to have some kind of an income. So there's already this aspect of class, which is entrenched in the question of gender, and that's where Virginia Woolf, coming strongly. The next important milestone in feminist theory would be that of Simone de Beauvoir, and all of you have, of course, heard of her, read her, and the famous quote is, "One is not born." Would someone like to end that quote for me? Complete it. Any student?
Then one is not born but becomes a woman.
Rather becomes a woman. Yes, very true. So what is this becoming? What is that Beauvoir is saying is, of course, the difference between biology and social conditioning, right? So sex is given, but gender is acquired. So, she talks about childhood particularly. I mean, it's a huge book with several parts, but I'm just talking about the part that deals with childhood, where she talks about dresses, relationships, companionships, games, sports, stories, folk tales, myths, and the understanding of the female body, which is completely controlled by patriarchy. Now, we have to be very clear here that Beauvoir or Woolf or Wollstonecraft didn't necessarily say that it is men per se. It is, there's often this misunderstanding that feminism is about a critique of men. It is a critique of patriarchy, and patriarchy that, and with masculinity studies, we are all aware. And even, of course, in Beauvoir itself, it was very clear that patriarchy does privilege man and masculinity, but patriarchy can also oppress a certain kind of man who doesn't fit into the idea of the ideal masculine, right? And we have seen examples of that. So Beauvoir brought out this theorizing, which was always already there in all these different consciousness. And everyone started talking about the sex gender dichotomy in a very, very serious way. And when Beauvoir started conceptualizing this, idea of dress being a certain marker of gender, games and sports being folk tales, myths reinforcing a certain idea of gender, then you increasingly realize, or there was a general agreement that sex is biologically given, whereas gender is socially conditioned. Now, of course, that has also been challenged, and I'll just, I'll come to that shortly. Now, this took off, and with after Beauvoir, there's this entire, kind of international recognition of an awareness around after the book was translated. And through the 1960s and 1970s, we see this take different forms in feminist theory. For instance, Alice Walker, in her book In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Womanist Prose, actually critiqued Woolf and other quote-unquote white feminists and coined the term womanism or womanist, who would represent women across colors, right? So the understanding was that it was no longer possible to sustain, because feminism till the 1960s or even the 70s, it is true that the women's movement had included women from other races, but the question of race was never central to the feminist agenda. So Walker wanted to turn that upside down and make race as much an important aspect of of the feminist agenda. And she felt that feminism, by definition, has become a white woman's project, and there's a need for Black women to articulate a different agenda. And these, of course, led to other kinds of feminist assertions. For instance, we have Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak and Chandra Mohanty, who are largely now seen as writing on post-colonial feminism. Then you would also have writers from the Middle East like Leela Abu Logod, Afsana Nazma Badi, and others who are writing, in that frame. And similarly, these are all evolving in the 1980s. We have intersectional feminists like Kimberly Crenshaw. And with intersectionality, Crenshaw started this whole idea that it's not simply enough, like what womanism was doing was just adding race to gender. And Crenshaw suggested that it was not simply enough to keep adding, to the potpourri, so to say. It is important to start unraveling it right from the bottom and try and understand how race, gender, class, caste, community intersect and thereby marginalizes certain groups of women. In fact, Crenshaw comes from a legal background, and her whole thesis, of course, it's a very interesting history. I'll just spend a moment. She was reading this particular legal case where a Black woman had raised objection in a court that there's a particular company where she had applied and she was not hired. She felt that she was being discriminated as a Black woman. Now, she didn't win the case, of course, because the court, the company got back saying that no, it's not true. We hire Black people and we also hire women. Now, what the court or the company, of course, the company wouldn't see, or what the court also didn't engage with, and Crenshaw came up with, is that it's true that the company hired Black people, meaning Black men, for physically heavy work. And it's also true that the company hired women, meaning white women, for secretarial work. So the Black woman was in the intersection of these. She was a woman as well as Black, would never really fit in their scheme of things. She could not be put into the difficult physical hard work because that was seen as quote unquote masculine work. She would neither be put in the secretarial work because that is to look, because there are certain notions and ideas of beauty. Beauvoir talks about it right now. We all have, and the obsession with fair and lovely and fair and handsome in India is a testimony to that. So she would not be, the black woman would not be, put in the secretarial job either. So from that case, Crenshaw developed this idea that when you're intersecting these multiple identities, there is a complete reversal of then rather than being simply being marginalized. And that, of course, has caught on ever since. Now, I just would stop this part. This is the last of the first part with Judith Butler's book reference to their book, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, published in 1990, and which kind of not only inaugurated, because it's not that queer studies wasn't there. I mean, we have had this since Sappho and Oscar Wilde and Radcliffe Hall and all of that. But Judith Butler theorized and popularized it in a way through Gender Trouble, which perhaps was never so mainstream earlier. And Butler offered a very strong critique of feminist construction of the category woman. And instead of simply adding to the category, for instance, class, gender, race, caste, community, and so forth, Butler challenged the whole notion that there is a dichotomy between sex and gender. And in fact, Butler suggested that how do we know that sex is actually given and sex itself is not a construction. So Butler draws on post-structural theory and imagines that it's no longer tenable to. So they have a critique of Beauvoir, and though Butler draws on Beauvoir, Butler also offers a very strong critique of Beauvoir and the idea of the woman as a universal category that can be sustainable, and therefore moves toward queer theory, so queer studies. Now, this I do in a very kind of jumping way from here and there and here and there, because otherwise we do this over months in our, as part of a general literature course that I teach. But I have to kind of, I had to figure out that, I couldn't really go on too long for this. So I now move to the second part and try and talk about the yellow wallpaper. Now, you have done Charlotte Perkins' Yellow Wallpaper. I'd like you to, apart from the Yellow Wallpaper, which was published in 1892, which is a text you think which is meaningful and famous of Charlotte Perkins? From the students, I mean. Sorry.
Yes, students, please speak up.
Don't take it as a test. I'm just trying to kind of get you involved with. You have already read the Yellow Wallpaper, right?
Yes, ma'am, they did.
They have, yes. Okay, never mind. Sometimes you may not remember. That's fine. Now, of course, don't worry, I'll not go into Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari and Gilbert and Goober in detail. I'll just kind of refer to. So Charlotte Perkins was born in 1860 and died in 1935, was married to, so sometimes in the Yellow Wallpaper, when it was published, you'll see that, her name is written as Charlotte Perkins Stetson. Later on, she married someone called Gilman. So then she's also known as Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So, it's safer to kind of stick to the maiden name, I suppose. And she grew up in a family who were very culturally rich. For instance, some of the major suffragists, you all know, those who asked, the first wave of feminists who asked for vote and voting rights, both in Europe as well as in America, like Harriet Beecher Stowe and others, were connected to their family through their father's side. But the father had abandoned the family. So she, despite having such very illustrious family connect, cultural capital, so to say, she didn't really have a very luxurious upbringing. In fact, they almost lived in poverty, and her education was in different schools, different parts. They had to keep moving. The mother was struggling, and all of that. And the story Yellow Wallpaper has almost become a kind of a manifesto, if I may say so, as something written in the late 19th century, and means so much and makes so much of meaning even today if you read out as for somebody, all of us, particularly post COVID, we know about what it means to be on house arrest and not being able to go out and not being able to do the things we love, etc. And I it's such a brilliant an exposition of what I always tell my students, that Emily Dickinson has this beautiful poem where she says, tell all the truth but tell it slant, slant, slant. So tell all the truth but tell it slant. You have to tell the truth but tell it in a in an indirect, slanted manner. And Yellow Wallpaper is an excellent, exposition of that, particularly when it comes to the institution of marriage and the idea of the domestic. So this is, I'm actually using this particular, version that is available on the net. I don't think it will be possible for me to share this, but this is from that original PDF. And this, if you type, this is what usually comes up in on the internet about yellow. As Yellow Wallpaper, the story, the PDF. And on page 64, 647, 648. So I'm sorry if you're using a different edition, but this is basically page 1, end of page 1 and beginning of page 2. It's like that. And let's read this passage, okay? John is a physician. John, as you know, is her husband. And perhaps, and look at that, what she does in the parenthesis, okay? I wouldn't say it to a living soul, of course, but this is dead paper and a great relief to my mind. Perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. So what does she say? That I'll not utter this to a living soul. So there's a dichotomy. Remember, she's publishing it in front of the whole world, but there is that subject positioning that is, as a woman, I'm not supposed to say this, that I'm not getting well because my husband is, and the irony gets even better. You see, he doesn't believe I'm sick. This is true of women's illness. In fact, if you have read Gilbert and Goober's, this excellent chapter that they have in their book, Infection in the Sentence Breeds. The Infection in the Sentence chapter in their book, actually, that they have two very important texts, No Man's Land, and the other one, I'm forgetting the name. So there they talk about Susan Gilbert, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Goober, talk about how in the 19th century, women are often associated with illness. In fact, hysteria was by definition was seen as women's illness. And the term hysteria, they argue, was derived from a Greek word, hystero, which is very close to the Greek word for uterus. So women, by definition, by physiology, was seen as being, more, kind of easy for women to be hysterical. And across the 19th century, whether you read Where Michel or Freud, and later on Freud in the early 20th century, there is huge amount of material where women are often associated with hysterical behavior. And so there are two ways of looking at it, in the sense that the narrator feels that I am unwell, but my husband doesn't believe that I'm sick. And why is it so difficult to show or kind of convince the husband? Because what can one do if a physician of high standing and one's own husband assures friends and relatives that there's really nothing the matter with one but temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency? What is one to do? My brother is also a physician and also of high standing, and he says the same thing. So you see, it's there's a certain way in which patriarchy functions, and patriarchy functions in medicine, in treatment, in science. So now, of course, there's immense amount of material about how science is also gendered, right? Now, this was not a time when Charlotte Perkins was writing. There wasn't a certain, awareness that science was gendered. That patriarchy was kind of implicated in all of our learning and knowledge. And so when she wrote this, she was writing it from a position of a feminist consciousness where the attack is not necessarily on the individual brother or husband or physician, but this overall systemic understanding of women or lack of understanding of women's health, both physical and mental. And then, of course, she offers a critique of what they prescribed. So I take phosphates or phosphites. I mean, it doesn't matter to her because whichever it is, and tonics and journeys and air and exercise, and absolutely forbidden to work until I'm well again. Personally, I disagree with their ideas. Personally, I believe that congenial work with excitement and change would do me good. But what is one to do? So again, she doesn't agree with that treatment mode at all. But what is one to do, right? Personally, she might disagree, but that is what the standard protocol is. So if you look at the last quote in this slide, I'm going to the third quote even before the first and the second. John says, if I don't pick up faster, he shall send me to a Michelle in the fall. But I don't want to go there at all. I had a friend who was in his hands once, and she says, it's just like John and my brother, only more so. So you see how the most famous, and where Michelle is actually a historical figure, right? Silas or Michelle was a renowned neurologist who was famous for the rest cure. And only much later, it was proved that many of his women patients suffered immensely because they never really could be cured by the kind of treatment that was. So what Charlotte Perkins is offering is a critique of the entire medicine system that is entrenched in a patriarchal understanding of women and her body, and imagining that they are the ones who understand her better than herself. So, personally, I disagree, but what to do? So again, going back to suggesting that while I have my own understanding of what my body needs or lacks or desires, but it's something that now there's also this very interesting exposition regarding marriage, right, in the story, apart from mental health, and there's this other aspect which is writing. So the story has so many different aspects. Of course, I won't be able to delve detail into each and every one of them, so I'm just touching. So regarding marriage, if you look at the first quote on this page, he is, meaning John, is very careful and loving and hardly lets me stir without special direction. I have a scheduled prescription for each hour in the day. He takes all care from me, and so I feel basely ungrateful not to value it more. Now, what do we make of a sentence like this? Of course, the narrator is constructing it as her husband is very careful and loving, doesn't let her do anything. He has her prescription all laid out. But I'd like the students to respond to it. Do you think this sentence or these sentences or these ideas, we are supposed to, as students of literature, are we supposed to take them at face value, or do they mean something else?
They mean something else, ma'am.
Yes. What do you think they do?
Tell Sushmita, what do you think?
Ma'am, I think that the patriarchal society believes that women should be the angel in the house. So that's why they like women to be captivated inside the house, takes care of them, and forbid the women to do any work outside.
Did she leave?
Yes, sir. I think ম্যাম
I
মিস
think
হয়ে গেছে।
there is a network issue. For that network issue, she just got leave. Let her know. The,
We just wait a while, okay? She will join in a moment, okay? I have talked to her. She has responded, so please be there. And kindly keep your camera open for a while, at least for 10 to 15 minutes, so that she feels that she is being heard, okay? Shumon, Ibrahim, Bhaktinath, Shagor, and the other members. She will join, just wait a bit. I guess these sessions are very enriching for all of you.
Yes, sir.
absolutely.
Definitely.
Definitely, sir.
Hello. Sorry,
Yes,
I
ma'am.
got accidentally, you know, I clicked something and I got accidentally logged out. I'm joining again. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. It's completely fine, ma'am. Just share your screen,
Sorry.
just share your PPT. That's it. Okay, ma'am.
Huh. Is my screen visible?
Not yet, ma'am, but I guess it will.
Okay, let me see. There's this technical things always,
Ma'am, should I share the screen on your
yeah,
behalf?
please do from your end, then we
Just
could.
1 minute, ma'am. One second.
Yes, yes. We are on slide 13. Is it my screen showing now or your screen?
Yes, yes, ma'am. Your screen is also showing, so I'm stopped.
Okay, okay, thank you. Sometimes these glitches. Yes, one student was responding to the query that I had, about this particular quote.
Okay,
Was
Sushmita, please
Sushmita, please, yes.
restart.
Let's do something,
Ma'am, I think at that time, the patriarchal society wanted women to be the angel in the house. So that's why her husband, John, wanted her to be captivated inside the house and forbade her to do any work or go outside. And she likes to do writing, but writing was associated with men at that time. So that's why she was forbidden to write as well.
Yes, excellent. In fact, look at the way this is almost what we would call somebody who is on house arrest. Like, I have a schedule prescription for each hour in the day. Now, if it is to be seen as care or if it is to be seen as control, like there is a very fine line between the two. And the way, in fact, Gilbert and Goober talks about it, the whole crisis of women trying to write, and from Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence, they derive this idea of anxiety of authorship, where women were afraid of writing and women were expected not to write, like you very rightly said, because writing was seen as, the pen was associated with the penis, and the power of it was like a phallic symbol, and women were not supposed to claim that space. So Charlotte Perkins, like I said, quoting Emily Dickinson, she will tell the truth but tell it with a slant. So it's for the reader to see whether this I have a scheduled prescription for each hour in the day, is it care or is it control, right? And regarding writing, and this is what I was coming to the second quote, there comes John's sister, such a dear girl as she is, and so careful of me. I mean, remember, John's sister is the perfect angel in the house. She takes care of the baby, she takes care of the narrator. I must not let her find me writing. In fact, there are several moments. she's a perfect and enthusiastic housekeeper and hopes for no better profession. So again, a critique of what the ideal angel in the house is supposed to be, and the narrator being, uncomfortable with that idea that I would only be a housekeeper. In fact, the famous book or work that I was thinking of Charlotte Perkins is a work that she wrote in 1898, Women and Economy, which was later enlarged and published 3 or 4 years later again as The Home. And I refer to the mortar and pestle in Therigatha, and the idea of housework, and how housework is seen necessarily, care work, housework is seen necessarily as women's work, and a critique of that emerging in Perkins's writing here, because she feels that the narrator cannot be as enthusiastic for housekeeping because there is nothing else better for me to do. And I verily believe she thinks it is the writing which made me sick. I mean, this is Gilbert and Goober's essay, Infection the Sentence, is perfect to read Charlotte Perkins' Yellow Wallpaper, because that's exactly what Gilbert and Goober argue, that infection in the sentence breeds. This is again a quotation from Emily Dickinson, where women, whoever had written or had tried to write in the 18th and the 19th century, always either had to hide behind a masculine pseudonym, like you all know about Wuthering Heights, referred to in the morning by Sir, and Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, all of them, taking names like Cara Bell, Ellis Bell. So George Eliot herself, despite being such a powerful writer, Mariana Evans to become George Eliot. So what Gilbert and Goober say, that women had to take the fig leaf, Eve had to wear the fig leaf to cover herself in order to be able to write, and writing became a way. So instead of anxiety of influence, Heron Bloom has this idea of, and I'm sure you all are already aware, that and this is partly a build on T.S. Eliot's individual and traditional and individual talent, where Eliot talks about how a new writer is constantly conscious of earlier writings influencing his writing. Harold Bloom builds on that and suggests that a new writer is always careful not to be influenced or overwhelmed by earlier writers. Gilbert and Cooper gives they tweak that idea of Harold Bloom, anxiety of influence, and they say that there is an anxiety of authorship, because women wanting to be authors, women wanting to be writers were looked down upon, were scared. So much of writing was done in hiding. In fact, Virginia Woolf in Room of One's Own said that for all much of anonymous in history is written by women. So whenever somebody couldn't put their name to it, it's because they felt the society wouldn't really expect them or accept them and their writing. And 19th century, of course, is flooded with that. Then there are more examples from the text, quotations from the text, and I'm coming to the last bit of the text, where I want to discuss a little bit about what is really there in the wallpaper, right? So Dr. Sarkar, please stop me when my time is up, because just give me a hint for 5 minutes or so, because I know you have a session after this also. Just let me know when I have 5 minutes left, okay? Thank you. Okay, so when she looks at the pattern, the narrator constantly sees that there is something, some shape, and initially she couldn't make out. And later on, in 652, she says, it is like a woman stooping down and creeping about behind that pattern. I don't like it a bit. I wonder, I begin to think, I wish John would take me away from here. So initially, there's a repulsion towards this woman who is sitting behind a pattern. And of course, you could look at the pattern as like a prison, a woman imprisoned. And that evolves as you move towards the end of the story, 654. This is the last page. The front pattern does move, and no wonder the woman behind shakes it. Sometimes I think there are a great many women behind, and sometimes only one. See, so she is seeing a pattern of imprisonment, of control, of women being behind bars, of behind conventions, and being restricted by norms, she crawls around fast and her crawling shakes it all over. Then in a very bright spot, she keeps still. The bright spot is because where the spotlight is on woman, she has to be still, she has to be proper, she has to do everything fine. And the very shady spot, she just takes hold of the bars and shakes them hard. So women are constantly doing it slant, they're doing it in the shady spot, they're doing it in the dark, they're doing it anonymously. So this wonderfully ties up with the idea of women, being kind of restrained by conventions, restrained both in terms of imprisoned by societal norms, women being literally behind bars, and women writing in disguise. The narrator also is writing in disguise, in hidden. In fact, there are several sections where the narrator ends suddenly. Oh, there is someone in the step. I must stop writing, right? So then in the shady spot, just takes hold of the bars, shakes them hard, and she's all the time trying to climb through, but nobody could climb through that pattern. It strangles so. So, you already see that women are trying to unshackle themselves, but it's strangling them. I think that is why there's so many heads. They get through, and then the pattern strangles them off and turns them upside down and makes their eyes white. So what we have is that the pattern never really let you escape. And so you could see it as a pattern of patriarchy, a pattern of mental health, crisis mental health, and so many other connotations are invoked in just that idea of a woman behind the pattern and shaking it. So she ends that saying, "I have got out at last," said I, "in spite of you and Jane." So the women behind the patterns are still stuck, but the narrative ends with this idea of freedom, right? I have got out at last, in spite of you and Jane, and I pulled off most of the papers so you can't put me back. So the papers were like the prison. Now, why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time. So this is the last line, that she's literally, she's come out of the prison, she's escaped, and she's found her freedom. So this takes me to the last part, and where I talk about the idea of madness in the archive through Mahila Samiti papers. This is from a project that we did way back between 2009 and 12 called Memory Movement and the Mahila Committees in Assam, a digital archive which was supported by the SEFIS program of International Institute of Social History and by Tezpur University. We basically digitized papers and documents, photographs at 3 Mahila Samitis in Guwahati, Dibrugarh, and Tezpur, and we also did audiovisual recording of women members and president secretaries, etc. So I was coordinating that project, and my PhD advisor, Imli Bhattacharya, was advising that. And team members included my colleague Rita Mani Narzari, late PA Anbarsan, Mitusmita Borua, and Puloma Pal. So, if later on you're interested, and I'll come back to this project later. But I want to just highlight one particular document that we found at the Tezpur District Mahila Committee office and which we digitized. This is a particular document which is where in 1948 they take a resolution, and the resolution, so bring back your memories of housework and mortar and pestle and all of that. And it says, and this is in English translation, the original is in Assamese: nowadays, women in urban areas without domestic help, so they're talking about 1940s, okay, hardly have time to come out as they're preoccupied with the kitchen. Yet, in order to be rightful participants in matters of culture and civilization, Krishti Aroha Bhata. So basically, Bengali speakers, so you'd understand Krishti or Shobhata. The Aikol needs some leisure time, Ajori. Considering all these circumstances, this Sabha proposes that the following timetable should be accepted in all the towns of Assam as fixed meal times: lunch at 12 noon, dinner at 10 p.m. No meal should be served after 1 hour of the proposed time. It is also proposed that 4 times a week, the afternoon snacks could be of an uncooked sort so that women have leisure time. Thirdly, to reduce spending a lot of time in the kitchen, we must include one dish in every meal that ideally requires no cooking or may be prepared quickly. We shall need a strong movement to implement these recommendations. The Sabha calls upon the women of Assam to take the initiative, discuss these proposals with men, and facilitate their implementation all over the different towns of Assam. So this is in 1948, the Tezpur District Mahila Samiti is taking a resolution that we should have fixed meal times, because other than, if you can imagine those days, even today in joint families, there are different people coming at different time, eating throughout the day, one is busy. And when we had this, as we had put that up as one of our area of interest during an exhibition that we did in 2011, Minakshi Bhuya, who was a secretary of Tezpur Mahila Committee for a very long time and is kind of no longer, she's still associated, but she's no longer the president. She mentioned that some of the criticism that the fixed mealtime resolution got was that in the newspapers, contemporary newspapers, Tezpur Mahila Committee members were called the appropriate residents of Tezpur. Now, to give you a little background, Tezpur is often associated with the Mental Health Institute that is situated here. And now it's the National Institute of Mental Health, Lokopriya Gopinath Bordolo Institute of Mental Health. But earlier, till the end of the 20th century, it used to be called a Pagla Phatek, basically prison for mad people, Now, when a group of women collectively decided that we need leisure time, and in order to get leisure time, we would like to fix meal time, they would be called mad. So as you know, and this is where Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari all become very, very important for us, that anyone who challenges the normative, anyone who challenges the template that is there readily available and who doesn't go by and subverts that, would be called mad, right? So these women who were looking at housework not as women's work, but as work, as care work. Now there's so much of emphasis on care work, care work as work. This is something that this women's collective asserted in the 1940s. And their assertion made the people go mad, literally, at them, and calling the women mad, that you are completely insane to suggest that people would have fixed meal time and you'll only serve meal because it is your destiny to do so. So now can you connect the two millennia, the Therigatha writing Mortar and Pestle, Charlotte Perkins writing about the home, women and economy, where she talked about housework and child rearing work and care work as work, and the Mahila Committee minutes here, again, going back to the whole idea of work. And whenever women have resisted the narrative of care, nurture, naturally benevolent, caring, nurturing mother, whenever they have resisted that, they have been called mad. So if you're interested in knowing more about the Mahila Samitis in Assam, I have a book recently published by Oxford University Press. It's called Gendered Publics, Janaprabha Hoikiani and the Mahila Samitis in Colonial Assam. You may look that up or order it for the library. Chandraprabha herself was an amazing woman. She was a mother outside matrimony. She gave birth to her son outside of marriage and she was ostracized, but she actually led the Mahila Samiti movement in Assam. She was the founding secretary of the Assam Mahila Samiti in 1926. So that's an amazing and fascinating story in itself. So let me not get started on that because then I'll never stop. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I hope I'm of use for your students, and I would eagerly wait for your feedback and suggestions. I have listed my email there. It was a pleasure interacting with you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an enlightening talk. And you have referred to how the women from Assam and the colonial Assam, how they have thrived for years. So, ma'am, I have a question before we move on to the audience. You titled your book as Gendered Publics. Okay, what do you mean by publics? Publics or publics? If you elaborate.
So I am drawing, when I say gendered publics, I'm drawing from the idea of Habermas and partly, Benedict Anderson and others who talk about the public sphere. Now, the Western idea of the public sphere, as Joan Scott and others have theorized, are completely, defined in terms of class, gender, community, and so on and so forth. When we look at public sphere and debates around public sphere in South Asia, we see, and one of the important, observations are, Dipesh Chakraborty is an important he makes an important intervention there, where he talks about the Adda as a public sphere, right? I mean, in Bengal and in Eastern India, we have this. I don't know, maybe in other parts of India, but in Assam, as in Bengal, we also have this Adda culture, right? So Adda as a possibility of a public sphere. So similarly, Uday Kumar, Professor Uday Kumar, who was my teacher and now teaches in JNU, he talks about how in early 20th century Travancore, an idea of a public sphere was emerging. And so there's, on the one hand, there's this idea that public sphere, publics, for instance, Francis Cody talks about publics as, people who are conscious of themselves as political subject. So I talk about this in the introduction. So when Cody talks about publics as people who are conscious of themselves as political subject, we almost take it for granted that publics are class, publics are gender, publics are community based. We are all aware of that. Like, there are working class publics, there are counter publics. Nancy Armstrong and others have, Nancy Fraser and others have written about it. But when I think of gendered publics, what I wanted is that we know that publics are already and always gendered. But in gendered publics, where people of certain categories of gender articulate and orchestrate agendas from their end and not the end of the public. So by gender publics, what I meant to say is that when these women were saying that, yes, we are going to cook, we are not saying we are not going to cook, but you should eat it at a fixed meal time. For instance, I'll give another example. When you all know about the Sarda Ain, in 1929, which raised the age of women for marriage from 12 to 14. And there was a whole controversy in 1934 in Assam, where Assam Mahila Samiti actually served a legal notice to a groom, citing the Sarda Act, that he cannot go ahead with the marriage with Mini Goswami, who was 12 years old at that time. And the Sarda Act had made it clear that you cannot marry anyone below the age of 14. It led to huge controversy. And again, newspapers and everything, they were called Biya Bhanga Homiti, people who break marriages. So they were called Puharir Mel, fisherwomen's gossip. And so they were called all these names. Now, what they were doing was, it's not that they're challenging marriage per se. So they're not the radical feminists that I'm trying to, see them as, but they're gendering the practices in the public. They're suggesting that it is important for us to recognize that this is exploitative. This is against the law. And we are going to challenge that, and we are going to gender that practice. So gendered publics, therefore. And there are many other, examples in the book, of course, if you'd like to have a look at it.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. So I'm asking the audience, if you have any questions or any comments, any observations, please go ahead. Pinky Roy has raised her hand. Pinky, if you have any questions, please go ahead.
No, sir.
Okay, any questions from Shagor, if you want to say something? Bhaktinath?
Ma'am, thank you for this such enriching lecture. Ma'am, I would like to know, you have mentioned that according to Bever, dress being certain marker of gender. And
Shagor, please open your
according to
camera.
Judith,
Please. Sorry, please open your camera.
and according to Butler, gender is performative. So I have a question out of the box. Can be dress performative, or it is a predetermined function, like for men, women, for the LGBTQ peoples? Like, according to the gender, can be dress performative?
Okay, so if I've got your question clearly, you're trying to ask how, from Hoover to Butler, the understanding of gender and the association with dress changes, right? Now, see,
Yes, ma'am.
if you look at, I think the obsession with dress is also a little bit Western, in the sense that in the East, if you see, the sari or the dhoti, both for men or women. When I say East, I'm kind of generalizing. Let's say South Asia, right? The sari and the dhoti can be worn in different ways, right? And can be agendered. You can wear a dhoti as a sari because it's actually very long enough, right? You can, there
Yes,
are
yes,
ways of,
yes,
and you
yes,
can wear a
yes.
sari as a dhoti. There are now, designers who are making, taking designs from saris and
Right.
putting it in. So if you look at it in our tradition, I feel that some of these dresses are agender. They are not necessarily already gendered. Sari dhoti example is one of them. But if you look at what Buvo was trying to say, and which she is right, that like even today in enlightened families, the moment there is a girl who is born, we carry pink frocks and pink bouquets and pink blankets. A boy is born, we carry blue this, blue that, blue clothes, blue dresses. I mean, then for the boy, guns and other things. For the girl, dolls and other things. So gender, what Butler is saying is that when they say that it is performative, is that the dress can become a part of that performative. We do not have to already think of the dress as being gendered, right? In fact, recently there was this college in Delhi University, Kamala Nehru College, where the teachers, as part of the farewell, had a fashion show where they cross-dressed. The idea is to embrace diversity, right? So I would like to believe, though we are still dressing a lot in terms of gendered understanding of dress, I'd like to believe that we are moving away from the Bouvorian kind of dress, at least in academic community, where we are no longer being fixated. But in the general society, I still see that dress is seen as an important marker of gender, and one is marked, of a certain gender by their dress. In general society, that's definitely true. But to come to Butler, of course, and in the LGBTQ community, they have completely subverted that and taken it to a different level altogether, with the dress and how the dress can become a part of the mode of the performative. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's totally okay, ma'am. I got it. But one more thing, ma'am. Like in different cinemas, like in popular cinemas, in new wave cinemas, we can see that directors now they're using this dress as a gender to to showcase those uh, characters they are trying to portray in their films. So, is that really that they are trying to gender those costumes to tell the stories of a man or a woman or of of kind of a family story? Is that like that, ma'am? Like,
Okay, you know, I don't know what examples you are thinking, but I'm thinking of two different sets of examples. Okay. One is a very problematic representation of the LGBTQ community in mainstream Hindi cinema, for instance, Desi Boys and others, where you'd always have a caricature of, the somebody who'd supposedly look like gay, and that's a very, very problematic way of representing the LGBTQ community. And I think Bollywood is also trying to grow up now. But on the other hand, you have dress being used very, very sensitively and cautiously by someone called Rituparna Ghosh, who uses, I mean, and in his own, like in Star Jalsha, when you watch some of the episodes, the
এবং
way,
ঋতুপর্ণ.
yes, and also, the even when he's not performing, even the way way they dressed is so meaningful, because they are in kind of gesturing towards fluidity, and and they're not making a caricature of themselves like many Hindi cinema does, for the LGBTQ. So there are two ways in which dress, or multiple ways in which dress can be used. It can be used to caricature an LGBTQ, trans person, or it could also be used to articulate sensitively about non-binary and identities and trans identities and alternative gender identities, like Ritupurna does, through his own. I'm not just talking about his films and filmography, but through his own dress and clothing. Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Bhaktinath, if you have any questions, please go ahead.
Mm. 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 Yeah. Mm. Mm.
Okay, then moving on to the other people who have joined. If you have any questions, please go ahead. Anybody? Okay. So thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Rocky has raised a hand. So Rocky, if you have any question, please ask, ma'am, directly.
Um, Ma'am, you have talked about women only here, I think. So, your title of the book is Gender Publics. So, ma'am, have you talked about men also here? Because nowadays, men are also victim. They are also victim or victims of domestic violence, false accusation. Because women are they are misusing the power of law or the 498 sections, and the men are not getting enough they are not getting enough chances have the to have the uh, what we can say that to have the power to prove themselves that they are not guilty, or they are also getting harassed, they are also getting tortured, and because of this we can see that because of domestic violence men are also committing suicides, they are also getting traumatized. And according to few reports of the Hindu Times of India, that almost 100 out of 1000 men in India, they are having the issues of domestic violence. So, so whenever we are talking about gender publics, so don't you think that we should talk about men also?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yes, there are two parts to your question, I'll do the second part first. When you talk about gendered public, should you talk about domestic violence? Yes, of course. And when you talk about Section 498 and women misusing that, that is a contemporary issue. Like this book is about colonial Assam, and we had no section to protect women at that time. So in the contemporary times, it is true that there are a few cases, but you'd see that the percentage of cases where the kind of attention that these cases get is way above the many different cases of domestic violence faced by women. That is number one. Number two, if there's this very important book by R.W. Connell, which is like a like a manuscript, manifesto for masculinity studies. So if you look at Connell's work and if you look at this whole idea of hegemonic masculinity, where men are expected to play a certain kind of a role of a strong, powerful, assertive, aggressive man, then they are also actually working within patriarchy. It is patriarchy that expects put this bar for men to be aggressive, assertive, powerful, strong, showing no emotion. So the problem is not with men and women. Like I said right in the beginning, it is with the patriarchal expectation of men and women. And you're right that men are facing domestic violence because men are increasingly, struggling to survive in a world where they have seen their fathers or grandfathers having a certain kind of authority and privilege because they were men in patriarchy, and those privileges are gradually eroding as women are also becoming equal. Gradually they're becoming, like I said, they're not yet fully. And when there is a kind of disbalance, there's always a chance that the transition can be painful. And I completely agree with you that men need as much help about domestic violence and how to address it as women do. And because our system is patriarchal, it thinks that only women can be violated domestically and not men. It's also an expression of patriarchy, where you think that the violence that would be meted out would always be a woman. The victim would always be a woman. In fact, there are in every district, there's a Government of India scheme where there are shelter homes for victims of domestic violence. But it doesn't. It has no provision for men. It was only for, because it's a patriarchal state. It's a patriarchal system. So they think that only women can be victims of violence. So that is to answer the second part of the question. Regarding the first part of the question, I do discuss the whole understanding of who was an ideal Dangoria in colonial Assam. But regarding men facing domestic violence in colonial Assam, there aren't too many references that I found in the archive. So in the book, like I said, gender public suggestion, it's through the Mahila. Sorry. Sagar, you want to say something? Okay. So in the book, it is through the Mahila Samiti's papers that I'm entering the question of gender. So men or masculinity is not necessarily, or even LGBTQ is not necessarily a major focus there. The focus is on Chandra Prabha Saikani and the Mahila Samitis, and it is through their story that I enter the question of gender. But you're very right to suggest that we have a patriarchal understanding of domestic violence where we always imagine that the victim would always be a woman. And therefore, when there is a male victim, in fact, there is a certain kind of shame in the male victim also to accept that he is a victim of domestic violence. In fact, I don't know if some of you follow social media and Netflix and other things. There's a very interesting series called Baby Reindeer, where it talks about a man who actually is a victim of stalking by a woman. Right. So now that conversation is opening up. And if you're interested in masculinity studies, please do read R.W. Connell. It's an excellent work.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, you referred to a web series. Can you please repeat it?
Baby Reindeer.
Baby Reindeer. Okay.
Baby Reindeer. It's on Netflix.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Ma'am,
Yes.
Joydev, please carry on.
Yes.
I have sent you a message in
No,
Google.
please just ask the question. Okay, just ask.
Ma'am, distributing free item or distributing money danger for long-term economy. How do you explain this?
Well, I think that is like a question that already has the answer in it. I agree with you, Joydev, completely that distributing these freebies, and I think recently there is a Supreme Court note that is taken that they will form a committee of taxpayers. I don't know whether it's just WhatsApp message or it's true, that, but. We need support for people who truly struggle. I do agree with that. And I do agree that some form of even direct cash transaction is something that is possible or maybe should be available. But the competitive kind of freebie economy now that we have got into, that is definitely problematic. I agree with it. Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for your.
Ma'am, I have something to know about.
Okay, Rizwan, please.
Yes, Rizwan.
There is my camera. Okay. Ma'am, you have mentioned that the medical science or medicine is patriarchal. So in that case, is there any way to depatriarchal the medical science or medicine or medical field?
So I meant in 19th and early 20th century. And of course, some part of gynecology is still heavily patriarchally defined. For instance, very often if you go with a gynecological problem, you'll be told that if it's a young girl, that, oh, first you have a baby and then we'll remove the uterus, because the function of the woman is always seen as associated with, so even if she has a disease or discomfort or whatever, she's expected to go through the discomfort because her role is to give birth to the baby, right? So that way, of course, many parts of medicine still remains patriarchal. It was very deeply patriarchal when Charlotte Perkins was writing. Some of it has been addressed, of course. Now we no longer have the kind of cure that Charlotte Perkins writes about, in the kind of controlling authority that her husband had over her. We no longer have those kind of psychological or psychiatric practices, but some practices still remain deeply patriarchal, right?
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
So thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We're running behind time.
Schedule, yes.
Yes, exactly. So we'll meet exactly at 2 o'clock for the post-lunch session. Ma'am, please join if you're free. Thank you so much again from my end. And on behalf of the Department of English, Coachbehar Panjab University, I hope you have enjoyed the interactive session. Thank you so much, everybody. We meet exactly at 2 o'clock. Have a delicious lunch and rejoin by 1:55 a.m. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I'm glad that your students participated. I'm very happy to share with them. And I hope that we'll continue with our interactions.
Yes, ma'am. And I have just recently ordered your book from Amazon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. See you at 2 o'clock, everybody.